Memoirs of Timur, the story of one of the world's great conquerors. Introduction to the Memoirs of Timur. The Memoirs of Timur, also known as the Mulfuzāt-i-Tīmūrī, offers a rare and fascinating glimpse into the mind of one of history's most formidable conquerors, Timur, Tamerlane, the 14th century Turco-Mongol warlord who carved an empire from the ruins of the Mongol domain and reshaped the Islamic world. Dictated in the first person and framed as a testament for his descendants, these memoirs blend autobiography, moral instruction, political philosophy, and religious reflection in a tapestry that is both self-aggrandizing and deeply human. From the windswept plains of Transoxiana to the gates of Delhi, Damascus, and Anatolia, Timur narrates his conquests not merely as triumphs of military genius, but as manifestations of divine providence and personal virtue. Each campaign is underscored by dreams, omens, and signs from God, reinforcing his belief in his sacred mission. At the same time, Timur lays bare the principles of leadership he claimed to live by: justice, loyalty, religious devotion, and a ruthless sense of order. But beneath the grandeur lies a text rich in psychological nuance. Timur is not just the scourge of empires, but a man conscious of fate, prophecy, and the judgment of history. His visions are vivid, his lessons didactic, his ambitions boundless. This work is as much an imperial blueprint as it is a spiritual confession. To read the Memoirs of Timur is to walk beside a conqueror, convinced he held the world not merely by the sword, but by divine right. Book 4. Mulfuzāt. Chapter 1. Be it known to my fortunate children, to my intelligent ministers, to my faithful and zealous nobles, that Almighty God, on account of the 12 following rules, which I have constantly practiced, hath conferred greatness on me, and hath made me the shepherd of his flock, and hath assisted me by his celestial aid, so that I have attained the high preeminence of sovereignty. First, having taken in hand the scales of justice, I have neither increased nor decreased the portion of anyone, but weighed equally to all. Second degree, I have administered strict justice to mankind, and endeavored to discriminate between truth and falsehood. Üçüncü, I paid obedience to the orders of God, and respected his holy laws, and honored those whom he had honored. Fourth, I had compassion on mankind, and conferred benefits on all, and by these qualities I gained the affections of God's creatures, nor did I ever vex a single heart by injustice. I never turned away a supplicant from my court, but whoever took refuge with me, I assisted. Fifth, I ever gave the affairs of religion precedence over worldly affairs. I first performed my duty towards God, and then attended to my worldly concerns. Sixth, I always spoke the truth, and ever listened to the truth, and with sincerity performed my religious and secular duties, and avoided the paths of crookedness. For I have heard that, when God created Adam, the angels said to each other, "A creature has been formed whose posterity will be liars, breakers of their promise, and guilty of wickedness." The Lord said to the angels, "I will send a sword among them, which shall cut in pieces every perverse or unrighteous person it encounters. As I have heard that the sword there meant is the power of princes, it is therefore incumbent on every monarch to speak and listen only to truth." Seventh, I have always performed whatever I promised to any person, nor ever deviated from my agreement. I was never guilty of tyranny nor injustice, nor ever permitted myself to fall into vice or infamy, nor, on any occasion, did I cut the cord of affection due to my children, grandchildren, relations, or connections. Eighth, I considered myself as the treasurer of the property of God, and never expended any of his sacred property without the sanction of his deputies, the clergy. In collecting the revenues from his servants, I observed lenity and discretion, nor did I ever take the wealth or possessions of any person unjustly, neither did I employ myself in accumulating riches or substance, but ever looked to the welfare and happiness of my soldiers and subjects. Thus I did not touch the accumulations of my father's nobles, nor was I covetous of the property of any person, for it is known to me, by experience, that Emir Husin, having cast the eyes of covetousness upon the property of his soldiers and subjects, and seized upon the wealth of his father's nobles, his prosperity was soon annihilated. Ninth, I considered obedience to God as consisting in submission to his prophet, and therefore acted according to the law of Muhammad, and did nothing contrary to that sacred code. I always considered the descendants of Muhammad, on whom be the peace of God, and the companions of his holiness as my friends, and performed to them the duties of affection. Tenth, I gave currency to the faith of Islam through all my dominions, and supported religion, by which means I gave stability to my government. For I had heard that church and state are twins, and that every sovereignty that is not supported by religion soon loses all authority, and its orders are not obeyed, but that every person, worthy or unworthy, presumes to meddle therewith. 11th, I gave free admission to the Sayyids, to the learned, and to the prelates of religion, and always treated them with great respect, and never turned any of them away from my court, so that they constantly attended my assemblies and induced the people to pray for my prosperity. I constantly associated with the learned and religious, and heard from them many anecdotes, both of sacred and profane history. Thus they related to me that the king of Constantinople once invaded the dominions of the king of Rai, but having heard that his court was attended by numbers of Sayyids and many learned and devout personages, he refrained from subduing his country, but wrote to the ministers and nobles. I have read in the heavenly books that whatever court is attended by learned, devout, and religious persons, that government cannot be overturned, and having been informed that such is the case of your country, I am convinced it cannot be subdued. He also wrote to the king, whereas I have discovered that your disposition resembles that of our former just monarchs, I have not injured your country, but having withdrawn my army, have ceased from attacking you. Farewell. 12th, I asked the blessings of the hermits, of the other inspired and holy persons, and besought their prayers. I also protected the Conquerors and the dervishes. I never vexed them, but captivated their hearts. I exerted myself in arranging the affairs of the Mussulmans, and avoided killing any of their people. I paid particular respect to the descendants of the Prophet, and was cautious never to degrade or injure any of that noble race. I also shunned the discourse of the wicked and ungodly, for I had heard that when God elects a person to the government of a country, and places in his hands the reins of authority over mankind, in order that he may rule them with justice, if he conducts himself with equity and propriety, his kingdom endures. But if, on the contrary, he is guilty of injustice and tyranny, and commits unlawful actions, the Lord renders him childless, and takes away his dominion and sovereignty, to give them to another. Wherefore, in order to preserve my sovereignty, I took justice in one hand and equity in the other hand, and by the light of these two lamps I kept the palace of royalty illuminated. As I had heard that just kings are the shadow of God, and that the best king is he who imitates the disposition of the Lord in forgiving sinners, I followed the examples of those just kings, and forgave my enemies. Chapter 2. I appointed 4 righteous ministers to govern my dominions. The first of these was the praiseworthy Mahmud, commonly called the Meteor of Khorasan. The next was Nasir ad-Din. I gave them positive orders that they were never to advise me to do anything that was unjust, that they themselves should never deviate from the path of rectitude, nor misrepresent evil for good, that they should always tell me the truth, and never deceive me by falsehood, and that they should not pry into the wealth and property of my subjects. For I had been informed that whenever God Almighty exalts any person to the throne of sovereignty, he confers on him special dignity and wisdom, by means of which he renders mankind obedient to him. This virtue is a ray of the grace of God, which shines on the monarch, and as long as he is grateful for that favor, his fortune and dominion continue to increase. Thus, when I reviewed my army in the plains of Anatolia, and found that it extended 15 miles in length, I considered that this innumerable host were all obedient to me, and returned thanks to God for having made so many of his creatures subservient to my will, although but a weak mortal like themselves. When I mentioned this subject to the learned of my court, they said, "The grace of God has thrown on you a divine ray, which is called the shadow of God, as the prophet hath said. A just king is the shadow of God, by means of which shadow a just monarch keeps mankind in subjection, and from the dread of that shadow the people are obedient, and his power and authority become current over the empire. Wherefore, as long I have been seated on the throne of sovereignty, I have been ever grateful for that favor, and have constantly paid respect to the orders of God by showing kindness to his creatures, and have always conducted myself with equity and justice. In consequence of this determination, when I had reached my 21st year, I resigned the guidance of my conscience into the hands of the pole star of religion, Sheikh Zin ad-Din Abu Bekr, Tatyabadi, upon which occasion he bound round my loins his own shawl-girdle. He then placed his own cap on my head, and put on my finger a ruby ring, on which was engraved, Rasti Varasti, righteousness and salvation, and said, "The aurora of your good fortune will shortly dawn, for I have seen by inspiration that in obedience to the orders of the chief of the descendants of the prophet, Ali, a man of God will become your tutelar saint. It is not convenient that you should now see him, but the time will come when he shall see you, and you shall see him." Thus, when I was 70 years of age, and was returning in AH 806 from the conquest of Anatolia, I paid my respects to the Qutb al-Arifin, pole star of wisdom, Sheikh Sadr ad-Din Ardabili, and having begged his blessing, requested that he would allow one of his disciples to accompany me to be my spiritual guide. He replied, "In the mountain of Salaran there is a fountain, the water of which is sometimes cold, sometimes warm. Go thither, and the first person that shall come there to perform his ablutions and say his prayers will be your guide." In compliance with the commands of the sheikh, I went up to the fountain, performed my ablutions, and having said my prayers, waited with anxiety to see who should come. To my great surprise, the first person who came to the fountain in the morning, made his ablutions and prayed, was my head groom, Mir Akher. The second and third day, the same circumstances were repeated. I was astonished and said to myself, "Surely the sheikh has made a mistake." But addressing myself to the man, I said, "O Syed, I have hitherto considered you as one of my inferior servants. How is it that you have attained this dignity and honor?" He replied, "By order of the Qutb al-Aktab, star of stars. Even from the very commencement of your sovereignty, I have been the firm supporter of your government." He then began to say his prayers, in which I joined him. During this religious act, I experienced both delight and inspiration. When we had finished our prayers, he said, "O Prince, you are at this moment the guest of God. Whatever the guest asks of his host is gratuitously given." Accordingly, I wished for faith. He replied, "The faith in Muhammad is eternal. It is a city where those who encompass it proclaim, 'There is no God but God,' and those in the interior reply, 'It is known there is no God but God.' That city is the gate of gates, and those who enter or come forth from it are constantly repeating those words." At this time I bent down my head in prostration. When I again raised my head, I saw that my companion had resigned his soul to his Creator. I was much affected. When I reported the circumstances I had seen to the sheikh, he replied, "The arrangement of the affairs of every country, and the power of placing and displacing of monarchs, with the bestowing of kingdoms on the worthy, and taking them from the unworthy, is in the hands of the true worshippers, who are the agents of God. Every country has its peculiar guardian, or patron saint, appointed by the Qutb al-Aktab. Whilst the guardian supports the monarch, the country flourishes, but otherwise it falls to decay. As long as the guardian exists, the state prospers, but whenever he is withdrawn, it declines, and if another patron is not appointed in his stead, that dominion is shortly subverted." The sheikh continued, "The man of God, who had charge of the kingdom of Kaiser, died this year, on which account you have been easily victorious over him." I considered this was a warning that my turn would soon come, but as I had still hopes that another patron would be appointed in the room of my deceased saint, I made an offering to the sheikh of 4,000 captives, natives of that country, in order to supplicate his intercession. Chapter 3. In the year 771, AH, AD 1378, when I had driven the Geats out of Turan and mounted the throne of Tartary, and had directed the royal proclamation, khutbah, to be read from all the pulpits, the sides, the learned, the prelates, the rich, and the poor, all raised their hands to heaven in prayer for my prosperity. But Khwaja Abid, who was the most celebrated prelate of that time, forbade them to pray for me, saying, "Do not pray for this murderer and bloodthirsty Turk, who has put to death an innumerable number of Mussulmans, nor repeat blessings on him." On that very night, the Khwaja dreamt that he saw me standing in the presence of His Holiness the Prophet, that he entered, and several times made his obedience to Muhammad without his salutation being returned. At length he called out, "O Messenger of God, do you permit this wretch Timur, who has murdered hundreds of thousands of your followers, and who has destroyed the habitations of so many Mussulmans, to stand near you, whilst you do not return the salutation of me, who am the zealous supporter of your religion, and the establisher of your law?" His Holiness replied to him in an angry manner, "Although Timur has shed much of the blood of my followers, as he has been the friend, the supporter, and respecter of my posterity and descendants, why dost thou forbid the people to pray for and bless him?" The Khwaja, having awoke, came even during the night to me, and asked pardon. When this intelligence reached the people, they all raised their hands in prayer for my prosperity, and, considering me as supported by the divine favor, bore witness to my right. In gratitude for this favor, I day by day showed more respect, attention, and affection to the descendants of Muhammad, and esteemed myself as the elect of God. Another circumstance which confirmed me in my opinion that I had the divine support occurred in the year 804, when I invaded the country of Anatolia with 400,000 cavalry, and Bayezid had drawn out his army to oppose me. Whilst I was reviewing my forces, a party of 300 of the Arabs of Iraq and Sayyids of Kerbala and Nejef, commanded by Sayyid Muhammad Miftah, came to my assistance. I ordered them to be admitted, considering their coming as an auspicious omen and a proof of the divine aid. Sayyid Muhammad, who was also the standard-bearer, advanced and said, "The fourth Caliph, Ali, appeared to me in a dream and said to me, 'Carry my white standard to the young Turk.' Having consulted the principal persons of Nejef, they agreed that you, the Prince Timur, who have just invaded this country, are the person meant." I returned thanks to God for this special favor and commanded that the history of the white standard should be recorded in the royal journals. Soon after this, Ike Timur, having come near me, called out, "May the victory be propitious." I took the word victory as an omen and gave him charge of the white standard, with orders to go and commence hostilities. On seeing the white standard, he was much affected and set out to comply with my commands. Another of the omens which afforded me much pleasure was this: when Tughlaq Timur Khan, the descendant of Genghis Khan, the first time he invaded Mavar-al-Nahar and had crossed the Sihun, Jaxartes, summoned all the chiefs to meet him. Haji Balas was afraid and preferred emigration to remaining, therefore set out for Khorasan. I was also divided in my opinion what I should do. I therefore wrote to my counselor, Pir, for his advice, whether I should go and meet Tughlaq Timur, or, having collected all my horde and tribe, proceed to Khorasan. He wrote me this answer: "It was asked of the fourth Caliph Ali, if the heavens were bows, and the earths the strings of those bows, and calamities were the arrows, and mankind the butt of those arrows, and the archer should be God, to whom ought mankind to flee for succor?" The Caliph replied that they should flee to God. "It is therefore your business to advance towards Tughlaq Timur, to embrace him, and to pluck the bow and arrow from his arms. Farewell." From this letter I received much consolation, and I went and met Tughlaq Timur on the banks of the Kogend River. He was much rejoiced at my coming. He made me one of his counselors, employed me, and consulted me on all occasions, until he received intelligence that his chiefs had raised the standard of rebellion in the Desht Kipchak. On this subject he consulted me, whether he should go himself to quell them, or should send another army to do so. I said to him, "In your going there is only one danger, but in sending there are two. The wise man is he who chooses the lesser danger." Hereon he praised me exceedingly. Again he consulted me respecting the government of Mavaralnahar. I said to him, "Your government resembles a tent. Let the poles thereof be made of the wood of equity, and let the rope pins be firmly fixed in the ground of justice, so that every person who enters the tent may pass out in safety. Act kindly to the Sayyids, the learned, and the prelates of that country, and preserve the people under the shadow of your justice. Do good to the good, and use policy with the bad, so that you may restrain the soldiers in the bonds of kindness." But he disgusted his chiefs by confiscating the property they had collected from the people of Mavaralnahar and compelling them to pay it into his treasury. He consulted me again on this occasion. I told him that the minds of the Turks were narrow like their eyes, that it was requisite to satiate them in order to gain their attachment and to tie up their tongues. As he much approved of my advice, he set out for the Desht Kipchak in order to quell the rebels, and left me in charge of Mavaralnahar. He further wrote an agreement, stating that he had divided the kingdom with me in a brotherly manner, but this was a mere pretense to keep me quiet while he was engaged with the rebels. Chapter 4. Another of the auspicious omens predicting my future greatness was this. In a dream I saw the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be the grace of God, who congratulated me and said, "In consequence of the support you have given to my descendants, the Almighty has decreed that 72 of your posterity shall sit on the throne of sovereignty." When I awoke, I wrote all the particulars of this dream to my peer. He replied by letter, "I congratulate you on this dream. Your having seen the Prophet, on whom be the grace of God, proves that you will certainly obtain numerous victories, and that many happy consequences will arise from this dream." As the Emperor Subuktagian, in consequence of his pity to a doe, whose fawn he had caught and released, was honored by a vision of the Prophet, who said to him, "In recompense of the pity that you this day showed to the animal, the Almighty will bestow sovereignty on your posterity for many generations. How much more so will he bestow on you, who through compassion to the Sayyids and other inhabitants of Mavaralnahar have delivered them from the cruel hands and slavery of the Geats. Doubtless your descendants shall reign for 72 generations." To elucidate the circumstance, it becomes requisite to mention that when Tughlaq Timur Khan invaded Mavaralnahar a second time, he sent me a friendly invitation. I therefore went to meet him, but he broke his promise of confirming me as governor of the province and gave the country to his son Alyas Khawaja and made me his commander-in-chief, Sepah Salah. But when he saw that I was dissatisfied, he produced the agreement engraven on steel between my ancestor Kajuli Bahadur and Kubil Khan, wherein it was stipulated that the dignity of Khan should forever continue in the posterity of Kubil Khan, and that of Sepah Salah with the descendants of Kajuli Bahadur, and that they should never oppose each other. When this agreement was read to me, in order to comply with its contents, I accepted the appointment of commander-in-chief, but as Alyas Khawaja had no talents for governing and permitted his soldiers to extend the hand of rapine, the inhabitants of Mavaralnahar came to me and complained that the Jets had carried off nearly 1,000 of their virgin daughters from Samarkand and its neighborhood, and that the orders of Alyas Khawaja were not listened to by his followers. Again, a number of the Sayyids of Termuz came and complained to me that the Turkish soldiers had carried into captivity 70 of their brethren and children, all descendants of the Prophet, on whom be the grace of God. On hearing of this, my honor was roused. I pursued the plunderers, defeated them, and recovered the captives. On this account, the Geats bound up the loins of animosity against me, and carried their complaints to Tughlaq Timur Khan, and wrote to him that I had raised the standard of rebellion, in consequence of which he issued an edict for putting me to death, which edict fell into my hands. It was at this time that I had the dream above mentioned. Another happy omen was this. My peer wrote to me. He had seen in a vision that the Almighty had appointed me his treasurer, and that the keys of the treasury would be consigned to me by his vizier Mustafa. This good news exalted my ideas and induced me to expect success from fate. Another time, when I was very much annoyed by the oppressions of the Geats and knew not what to do, I received the following letter from my peer. The supported of the Lord, may God continue to protect him. I have seen in a vision the messenger of the Lord of all worlds, who has promised to make you his vicegerent and support you, and therefore be not afraid nor despond, for he is with you. I was much rejoiced by this letter, and became strong of heart, although I was in daily expectation of the arrival of Tughlaq-Timur's edict to put me to death. And when the edict did arrive, the saint, Amir Keelan, sent me this verse of the traditions of the prophet: "Flight is proper for him who has not the power to oppose." I therefore fled to Khwarizm with 60 horsemen and wrote a description of my situation to my peer, and received the following answer to my letter: "May God protect Abul Munsur Timur. Let him lay down these 4 rules for his conduct, that with the arm of magnanimity he may be successful and prosperous through life, as is recorded in the traditions. First, be determined in whatever you undertake. Place your undertakings on faith in God, and do not relax your exertions. Second, invest yourself with the robe of honor, and permit not fornication or adultery to be committed in your dominion. It is related that a crane once saw in her nest a young raven associating with her young ones, and for several days and nights she permitted it to remain. At length a number of cranes collected and tore the owner of the nest to pieces with their beaks and claws. The honor of a man should far exceed that of birds, especially that of princes, which should ever protect the respectability and reputation of their subjects. Third, do not neglect consultation, prudence, and caution, for every dominion which is void of these is soon overturned. Fourth, it is a tradition of the illustrious caliphs that stability is better than perturbation. Therefore endue yourself with bravery and magnanimity. Grace be with him who follows the true direction. Another presage of my good fortune was this: a celebrated astrologer waited on me and delivered a plan of my horoscope, stating that at the time of my birth the planets were in so favorable and auspicious conjunction as certainly to predict the stability and duration of my good fortune and sovereignty, that I should be superior to all the monarchs of the age, that whoever were my enemies should be subdued, and whoever were my friends should be prosperous, that I should be the protector of religion, the destroyer of idols, the father of my people, that my descendants should reign for many generations, and that they should be prosperous as long as they continued to support the Mohammedan religion, but if they should deviate therefrom, their dominion would soon be annihilated. Chapter 5. About this time I also had an extraordinary dream. I thought I was seated on the seashore, and that I had in my hands a large net, which I dexterously threw, and caught a number of crocodiles and other large fish. This dream I interpreted thus: that the net was my dominion, which shall spread over the face of the globe, and that all mankind will become subject to me. When I invaded Fars, I saw in a dream that a number of bottles of wine had been presented me, and that I broke them in pieces with my sword, by which means I much injured the sword. The interpretation of this dream was that I should suffer some misfortune. It was shortly after this that Shah Mansur attacked me suddenly with 5,000 horse, and although I completely defeated him, nevertheless, at that time, my troops were defeated in the desert by Tuktumush Khan, who, forgetting my kindness to him and my raising him to be king of the Desht Kipchak, had watched his opportunity and attacked me with an army as numerous as the drops of rain. I therefore wrote to him, "Whoever returns evil for good must be a bastard, and will certainly receive his reward. When you fled from Oros Khan, did I not give you an asylum? I released you and made you king of the Desht. As you have not been sensible of my kindness, but have taken this opportunity to attack me, be assured you shall suffer for your bad intentions." About this period I dreamed that the sun arose in the east, and having ascended over my head, became suddenly eclipsed. It then retrograded and sunk in the east. The interpretation of this dream was that Tuktumush Khan was typified by the sun, that he should advance against me, that he should be defeated and compelled to retreat by the same road he came. Thus it was that Tuktumush Khan came against me with a numerous army, but my troops attacked him with the fierceness of lions and destroyed them, by which means the tribe of Juji were plundered and put to shameful flight, and I returned successful and victorious. When I was about to invade Arabian Iraq, I dreamed that I had entered a valley, in which I saw a number of lions, that they came close to me and, in fact, surrounded me. Afterwards, when I entered that country, I found that the inhabitants of it, although Arabs by descent, had very much the features of lions. They, however, brought me valuable presents, and I subdued the kingdom of Iraq Arab. When I was about to invade Hindustan, and my chiefs, by their backwardness, rendered me doubtful whether I should proceed, I dreamt that I was in a large garden, and saw a number of people who were pruning the trees and sowing seeds, that the garden was full of trees, both great and small, on the tops of which the birds had built their nests. I thought that I had a sling in my hand, and that I destroyed the nests with stones from the sling and drove away all the birds. This dream was realized when I took that country by my expelling all the sultans and taking possession of the kingdom. Again, when I invaded Syria, the armies of Egypt and Constantinople both joined the Syrians, on which occasion my nobles came to me and said in a desponding manner, "To contend with 3 nations and to defeat 3 armies requires a greater force than we have." I was then engaged in prayer, and soon after having fallen asleep, I dreamt that I ascended a mountain, and that when I arrived at the top, I was overwhelmed in black and white clouds, and caught in a whirlwind of dust. This was succeeded by a heavy shower of rain, which soon laid the dust. The learned of my court expounded the dream in this manner. The mountain is the kingdom of Syria. The black and white clouds are the armies of Egypt and Syria. The rain is the army of your majesty, which will shortly annihilate your enemies and settle all these disturbances. I placed much faith in my dream, persevered in my intentions, and shortly defeated the armies of Syria and of Egypt, and was successful and victorious. Again, when the Kaiser Bayezid Bajazet advanced against me with 400,000 warriors, and the shouts of the Rumians were excessive, I addressed myself to the Prophet and his descendants, and employed myself in prayer that night. I dreamt that I was traveling through a wilderness, and that I saw a number of people on all sides. At this time I observed a great light, which seemed attached to the horizon of the heavens. I went towards the light, but was interrupted by 3 mounds of earth, which fell before me, and from which there arose a great smoke. I also saw 5 persons, who, having taken the hands of each other, proceeded before me. From seeing these persons, I felt a degree of awe and dread, and I heard someone say, "This is the prophet who is going with his friends to heaven." Upon which I hastened, and having overtaken them, made my obeisance to Muhammad. The prophet made a sign to one of his 4 companions, who had a club in his hand, to give it me. When I took it in my hand, it became very long. When I awoke from my sleep, I found myself exalted and exhilarated by this dream, and became strong of heart, as if I had been strengthened and aided by the white standard of Ali. And it was in consequence of this dream that I was enabled to take from the Kaiser the kingdom of Rum. After this, when I called to mind the toils and labors I had undergone in subduing so many countries of the world by the arm of courage, I considered whether it was likely that my good fortune and sovereignty should endure, and was anxious to discover which of my sons or descendants the Almighty would place upon my throne in order to preserve my fame and glory. Shortly after this, I saw in a dream the prophet of God, who told me that 72 persons of my descendants should be rulers of the earth. Still, I was anxious on this subject, till I saw in a dream that I was sitting under a shady tree, having innumerable branches and leaves, the top of which reached to the heavens. From the leaves and branches of this tree there fell, like a heavy shower of rain, various kinds of fruit. Immediately all sorts of reptiles, birds, cattle, and other animals surrounded the tree and voraciously began eating the fruit. Afterwards they violently attacked each other with their claws and beaks. When I had tasted the different kinds of fruit, I found some of them sweet, some sour, some bitter, some insipid. At this time I heard a voice proclaim, "This is the tree which you yourself have planted." When I awoke, the interpreters expounded the dream thus: "You are the tree, the leaves and branches are your posterity, who shall be the supporters of your state and sovereignty, and will benefit mankind by their benevolence." Another time, when I had reflected on the past, I repented and was ashamed of many of my doings and sayings, and soon after dreamt that I was sitting in a desert, overgrown with thorns and thistles, and that I was surrounded by dogs, hogs, demons, men and women with frightful and horrid countenances. I was so terrified by their appearance that I awoke, and was so much impressed by this dream that I wrote the circumstance to my peer, and received from him the following answer: "That which you saw in a dream was the representation of your vices and evil actions, such as tyranny, passion, lust, injuring the creatures of God, avarice, covetousness, envy, and pride, which are all of the worst quality. Therefore, change your habits, and you will receive the reward of good actions and virtuous morals." In consequence of this advice, from that time I refrained from injuring mankind and from all enmity and strife. Another time I dreamt that I entered a garden filled with flowers and odoriferous herbs. In it were also many fruit trees and running streams. It was inhabited by beautiful young persons and charming songsters, also by handsome boys and girls, all of whom came and paid their respects to me. I was much delighted with them, and so pleased with my dream that I again wrote all the particulars to my peer, who wrote me in answer, "Return thanks to God, for the Almighty has shown you the representation of your good actions and virtuous deeds, and know that the Prophet, on whom be peace, hath said, 'Every man at his birth has two devils in attendance.' I also had them, but by the grace of God I have subdued them. It is therefore incumbent on every man to imitate the conduct of the Holy Prophet, and endeavor to subdue his animal and brutal passions, and invest himself with good qualities and praiseworthy morals, by which he may attain eternal felicity. Farewell." At the time that I determined on a holy war against the unbelievers of China, Kata, and having made my preparations and marched from Samarkand, I became doubtful whether my life would last the accomplishment of this design, and whether I should proceed on this sacred expedition or relinquish it. I dreamt that I had climbed a high tree, and that I was sitting on one of its numerous branches, when the branch broke, and I fell to the ground. I also thought that I was carrying a pitcher of wine on my head, and was going along the road. Suddenly the pitcher fell from my head, and was broken, and the wine spilt. I then thought that my father Teragay took me by the hand, and led me into a meadow, and having left me there, went away. The interpreters expounded this dream in a manner that was not satisfactory. I therefore resigned myself to the decrees of Providence. Also about this time I dreamt that I was in a frightful desert, and that I was quite alone, but that after travelling some distance I came to a green plain, in the midst of which was a garden. I entered the garden and found it delightful. It contained fountains and rivulets of pure water, and trees inhabited by sweet-singing birds. In the middle of the garden I saw a lofty palace, and a stately-looking man was seated on a throne in the hall of the palace, and on his right and left hands stood numerous attendants, and they had in their hands papers and pens, and several volumes were lying before them. I asked, "What is this man writing?" I was answered, "In these volumes the destiny and period of life of all mankind is written." I wished to inquire how long I had to live, and what was to be my destiny, but I awoke from my dream. At the time I invaded the province of Fars, the people of Shiraz took part with Shah Mansur, and having joined him, put my governor, Hakim, to death. I therefore gave orders for a general massacre of the inhabitants of Shiraz, on which the very religious Syed Abul Ishaq waited on me, and requested that I would cancel the cruel order. I, however, would not listen to the request of the Syed. That very night I dreamt that I saw the Prophet, upon whom be the grace of God, who frowned on me and said, "One of my posterity came to your court and interceded for a number of culprits. Why did you not attend to his petition, that I might have interceded for you at the court of the Almighty. When I awoke, I perceived my error, and immediately mounting my horse, I rode to the residence of the Syed and begged his pardon. I also put an immediate stop to the slaughter and ordered that Shiraz should in future be annexed to the royal exchequer and an annual allowance made to several of the inhabitants. And I also bestowed on Khwaja Mahmud the district of Merjan and conferred a title on him. I then made a vow that I would never again reject the petition of a Syed, that I would never be deficient in respect to them, but that I would always do honor to the descendants of Muhammad and the companions of His Holiness, that being convinced of the obligation of aiding and befriending them, I would more and more extend my favor towards them. I communicated all these circumstances to my peer, who immediately wrote on the margin of my letter, "May God grant all thy desires, and may this lesson prove auspicious to the posterity of the Prophet, through the intercession of Muhammad and the divine grace. In obedience to the orders of God, and for his sake, you must befriend this class. Do you not see that by honoring and respecting them, you draw down blessings on your own posterity, and as long as the conduct of the latter shall be proper, they may hope for aid in this world and the next. Let your kindness to them increase and increase, salvation to him who follows the true guidance. But of all the presages of my future greatness, that which gave me the most pleasure and confidence in the divine aid was a circumstance that my father Teragay told me. He said, "Some time previous to your birth, I dreamt that a person of a luminous countenance, resembling in figure and dress an Arabian, presented me with a naked scimitar, with which when I began to fence, there issued from it numerous sparks which illuminated the whole earth, after which there spouted from my hand a jet dough, which threw the water into the air, and which fell in large drops on the ground. The interpreters being consulted, thus expounded my dream. Of your sons, one will be a world-subduing sword, who will purify the earth from the defilement of idolatry, and spread the true religion over the face of the globe, and will generally benefit mankind, and his descendants and posterity shall be numerous." This omen rejoiced me extremely. I was convinced that sovereignty was written in the page of my destiny, but resolved to be contented with whatever of good or evil might occur to me, and to be satisfied with the decrees of Providence. Memoirs of Timur, Book 5, Commencement of the History. Chapter 1. My father Teragay related to me the following circumstance relative to my name. Soon after your birth, I took your virtuous mother to pay our respects to the celebrated Saint Sheikh Shemz-ad-Din. When we entered his apartment, he was reading aloud the 67th chapter of the Quran, and was repeating this verse: "Are you sure that he who dwelleth in heaven will not cause the earth to swallow you up, and behold it shall shake? Timur." The sheikh then stopped and said, "We have named your son Timur." I was much delighted by this anecdote, and returned thanks to God that my name was taken from the sacred volume. It was also a great inducement for me to learn that chapter by heart. When I had attained my 7th year, my father took me by the hand and led me to the school, where he placed me under charge of Mullah Ali Beg. The mullah, having written the Arabic alphabet on a plank, placed it before me. I was much delighted with it, and considered the copying of it as an amusement. When I reached my 9th year, they taught me the daily service of the mosque, during which I always read the 91st chapter, denominated the Sun. While seated in the schoolroom, I always took the chief seat, and often fancied myself the commander of all the other boys. One day a subject of conversation was started, on which was the best mode of sitting. Each boy gave some answer to the question. When it came to my turn, I said, "The best mode of sitting is on the knees, for Muhammad has commanded, whilst in prayer, sit on your knees," on which all the spectators praised me exceedingly. When we came out from school, we began to play as children, but I, assuming the command, stood upon a high mound, and having divided them into 2 armies, caused them to fight a sham battle, and when I saw one of the parties worsted, I sent them assistance. At 12 years of age, I fancied that I perceived in myself all the signs of greatness and wisdom, and whoever came to visit me, I received with great hauteur and dignity. At this time I selected 4 amiable companions with whom I constantly associated, and when I attained the sovereignty, I remembered their claims, as well as those of my other playfellows and acquaintances, and promoted each of them according to his deserts. By the divine grace, from the time of being 9 years old till I had reached 71 years, I never dined alone, and never walked out without a friend. And whenever I put on new clothes, on taking them off, I gave them to my companions, and whatever they asked from me, I never refused, but gave it without humiliating entreaty. At 14, I had formed an intimacy with a very handsome youth, and passed great part of my time with his tribe. He was sensible of my partiality, and also showed great affection for me. At length a blackguard of Mavaralnaha, who was called Mulach, and who under the semblance of a student had been admitted into the circle of our acquaintance, took a liking to the youth. But as this fellow was an entertaining companion, I was pleased with him. This circumstance made him very vain, and he used to talk in a familiar and obscene way. One day, having given him admission into our society, I overheard the boy say to him in a familiar manner, "I don't want your kisses." I was quite nettled at these words, and resolved never to allow such impropriety of conduct, either in myself or others. At 16, my father took me by the hand and brought me to his own monastery. He there addressed me. "My boy, our ancestors from generation to generation have been commanders of the armies of the Jagte and Burlas family. The dignity of Sepa Salar, commander-in-chief, has now descended to me, but as I am tired of this world, and consider it no better than a golden vase filled with serpents and scorpions, I mean, therefore, to resign my public office, and retire from it in order to enjoy the delights of tranquillity and repose. But as I have founded this village, and erected this monastery in my own name to perpetuate my fame and that of our family, I must particularly request that you will not diminish aught of its revenues or privileges." My father then related to me the genealogy of our family, extending to Tumune Khan, whose genealogy is carried back in history to Japhet, the son of Noah. He added, "The first of our family who had the honor of conversion to the faith of Islam was Kerachar Nuyan, who was the Gurgan, son-in-law of Jagtai Khan. As he was a sensible man, he of his own accord adopted the faith of Muhammad, and said to his family and people, 'When I look around me in the universe, I see but one world, yet I am of opinion that there are other worlds besides this. But I am also convinced that there is one only God who hath created all these worlds, and who is all-sufficient to rule and direct all these worlds. But as he has chosen this world as his special dominion, he has deemed it requisite to have ministers to instruct mankind. He hath therefore chosen Mohammed to be his vizier in this world, and as it was requisite that Mohammed should have ministers to extend his religion, he hath appointed the holy race of caliphs to this dignity. Now, my son, as this speech of our ancestor is quite conformable to my judgment, I also have become a sincere Mussulman. I request, O Timur, firstly, that you will imitate the example of your illustrious progenitor in conforming to the sacred religion of Mohammed, on whom and on his posterity and companions be the peace of God. I entreat you never to deviate from his law, but ever to respect and honor his descendants and followers in the persons of the Sayyids, the learned, and the prelates of his religion. Associate with them, and constantly ask the blessings of the dervishes, the hermits, and the righteous upon all your undertakings. Obey the commands of God, and have compassion upon his creatures. Secondly, that you will encourage and give currency and support to the religion of the Prophet. Thirdly, that you will believe that we are all the servants of God, and appointed by his decree to inhabit this terrestrial globe, that our destinies are predicted, and that whatever is written on our foreheads must come to pass, as it is decreed that we shall all do so, and have not the power of quitting this world. We must be content with whatever fate determines, and be satisfied with whatever God shall give us. We should also assist our poor brethren, and constantly, by every means in our power, befriend all the creatures of God. Let us always acknowledge the unity of God, and by our practice strengthen the 4 pillars of the law, viz. prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and alms. Fourthly, Be affectionate to your relations and connections. Injure no person, nor keep anyone in bonds, unless the bonds of kindness. Deprive no man of his rights by fraud or tyranny. Clothe yourself in the robe of justice. Avoid the society of the bad and wicked. Keep no man in prison more than 3 days, and distribute provision to the poor and hungry. And plant yourself in the hearts of your subjects by beneficence. Otherwise you will fall from your power and prosperity. When my father had finished his discourse, I promised faithfully to follow his counsel and to comply with his advice. When I attained the age of 17, my father being indifferent about worldly affairs and in delicate health, I took upon me the charge of his private affairs and made the following arrangements. I formed every 100 sheep into a separate flock and appointed a shepherd to each flock, whose profits were to be 1/4 of the milk, the butter, and the wool. I did the same with the goats, separating the wethers from the females. I likewise denominated every 20 horses a stable, separating the horses from the mares, also the camels in the same manner. Of the various omens which predicted my future greatness, one which most tended to raise my hopes was this. One day I went to pay my respects to the famous Saint Amir Kalal, and when I entered the assembly, I seated myself at the very lowest end of the room. The saint looked at me and said, "Although this boy is in appearance so little and young, he is in fact a great personage." He then made room for me near himself, and after looking at and conversing with me for some time, he fell into a slumber. After he awoke, one of his servants presented to him a tray of bread and sweetmeats. He stretched out his hand, and having taken 7 cakes and sweetmeats, gave them to me, saying, "Eat a mouthful of each of these, in consequence of which the 7 regions of the world shall become subject to you." I was astonished at these words, and the people of the assembly looked first at each other and then on me, but through awe of the saint no one ventured to speak. I therefore folded up the cakes and carried them to my father, who said to me, "Kalal is a great personage, a descendant of the prophet, a seer of visions and a worker of miracles. Whatever he has told you of his visions will certainly come to pass. Take care of these cakes, and do not give of them to anybody, but regard them as the greatest blessing from the blessings of that holy personage." Some time after this event, my father went with me to pay his respects to the saint, who said to him, "O Prince," here follows a line in the Jagte Turkey. At this time there was a basket of nuts before him. He ordered my father to count them. After he had done so, he informed him that there were 370 nuts. The saint said, "Each of these 300 nuts signifies a year. The remainder are the number of Timur's posterity, which shall reign for 300 years. He then presented the basket to my father, which I took, and placed the nuts with the cakes. When I mentioned these circumstances to my mother, she took my head between her hands and blessed me. The cakes and the nuts remained in my possession for many years, during all which time my prosperity increased. Some time after the affair of the nuts, my mother went also to pay her respects to the saint, and was most graciously received. At length he said to her, here follows a verse in the Jagte Turkey. 70 of Timur's sons, grandsons, and descendants shall reign for the term of 300 years, provided that they make no change of the Mohammedan religion, but give currency to the faith of Islam. Neither shall they vex nor injure the descendants of the Prophet, but do everything in their power to give him satisfaction for the blessing he conferred on mankind. Bounty shall be heaped upon bounty, and prosperity added to prosperity, as long as they continue to show kindness to the relatives and descendants of His Holiness. When my mother reported to me the conversation of the saint, although then only 17 years of age, I made a solemn vow to the all-merciful God that I would never neglect the descendants of the Prophet, but do everything in my power for their honor. Chapter 2. When I had entered my 18th year, I became vain of my abilities, and thought no person superior to myself, or anything too difficult for my undertaking. I was at this time very fond of riding and hunting. One day, having pursued a deer, while at full gallop, I came suddenly to the brink of a ditch, more than 5 guz, 10 or 15 feet, in breadth, and 4 guz in depth. I attempted to turn my horse, but he was obstinate. I therefore tried to make him jump over the ditch. He reached the opposite bank with his forefeet, but not being able to clear it, fell. While he was struggling, I had slipped my feet out of the stirrups, sprang from the saddle, and reached the bank. The horse tumbled into the ditch and was disabled. My companions soon after came up and congratulated me on my good fortune and happy escape. I said, it was God who had preserved me, who is also the bestower of fortune. My friends not being able to jump the ditch, I went round to them, and having mounted a led horse, proceeded homewards. When we had gone some distance, it became dark and began to rain, in consequence of which we lost the road, and as the night was extremely cold, we thought we should have perished in the desert. About this time we saw some black tents or huts, upon which my companions said, "These are hillocks of sand and dust." So we gave ourselves up for lost. I therefore threw the reins on my horse's neck and took hold of the mane. The horse raised his head and began to neigh and stretched his neck. When we arrived near the tents, we saw a light shining through one of the doors, which gave us courage. I therefore alighted from my horse and entered the tent, the inhabitants of which, supposing I was a thief, hallooed out and prepared to attack me. But when I told them all the circumstances, they were ashamed, and having cleared out a room which was constructed underground, lighted a fire for us, on which my companions entered, and we took possession of the room. The good people shortly brought us some temach karuni soup, of which I eat a great quantity, and was quite refreshed. They also brought us some blankets, upon which we lay down, but they were so full of fleas that I could not sleep a wink all night. After I had mounted the imperial throne, I recollected all the circumstances of my hunting excursion, of the cold and frost of the night, and of our society in the cellar, in consequence of which I sent for the family, and made them terkan, i.e., amply rewarded them. During this year I was very ill for 4 months, and they could not find out any cure for my disorder. I therefore gave up all hopes of life. For a week I could eat nothing, but on the 7th day they gave me a pomegranate. Soon after I became quite languid and insensible, and while in the swoon I fancied that they had bound me on a wheel, and were bearing me towards heaven, and afterwards descending to the earth. I did not recover from the fit, till they had burned me between the forefinger and the thumb. When I felt the heat of the iron, I opened my eyes, and saw the servants and my father and mother standing around me, crying aloud. I also joined in lamentation. Soon after this I became hungry, and the physicians having asked me what I would like, and they would bring it, I called for yekni and some of the temach broth. I eat a whole plate full of the latter, and during the night fell into a deep perspiration, and from that time recovered. Another of the auspicious omens predicting my sovereignty was this. One day during this year I was seated in my father's monastery, and was reading the 67th chapter of the Quran, when a grey-haired Syed entered the monastery, and having looked attentively at me, demanded my name. Having told him, he compared it with the chapter I was reading, and said, "God Almighty has given the sovereignty of the earth to this boy and his posterity." I looked upon this circumstance as a mere dream, but when it reached the ears of my father, he encouraged my hopes and showed my horoscope to one of the astrologers of Turkestan, who said, "He will be superior in his own dominions, in dignity and authority to any of his predecessors, and he will add other countries to his own dominions, and will be an ornament to religion." He then said to me, "Your descendants and posterity shall rise to the very highest dignity." When I had heard these words, I gave him a handsome present. At this period, I passed much of my time in reading the Quran and playing at chess. I was also much employed in charitable actions and soliciting the blessings of the hermits and dervishes. I was also fond of horsemanship, and I employed a celebrated riding master to teach me the art, and also to instruct me in the science of maneuvering an army. I frequently assembled my companions, and having taken upon myself the title of commander, made them all obedient to me. And whenever we rode out, I used to divide them into 2 armies, and taught them how to advance and how to retreat in the field of battle. Chapter 3. About this period, I asked my father to tell me the history of our family from the time of Yafet Aglan. which he did nearly in the following manner. It is written in the Turkish history that we are descended from Yafet Aglan, commonly called Abu al-Atrak, father of the Turks, son of Japhet. He was the first monarch of the Turks. When his fifth son, Alj Khan, ascended the throne, the all-gracious God bestowed on him twin sons, one of which was called Tatar, the other Mogul. When they were grown up, Alj Khan divided the kingdom of Turkestan between them during his lifetime. After they were seated on their respective thrones, they became proud of their authority and forsook the religion of their ancestors, placing their feet in the paths of infidelity. Tatar had 8 sons, from whom are descended 8 Ulus tribes. Mogul had 9 sons, from whom are descended 9 clans. These two parties frequently disagreed and fought many battles in the plains of Turkestan. Till at length, after the establishment of the Islam faith, Tumena Khan was seated on the throne of dominion of the region of Turkestan. He had 2 sons by one birth, one of which he named Kajuli, the other Kublai Khan. When Kajuli had arrived at the age of manhood, he dreamt one night that he saw 2 stars rise from the breast of Kublai Khan and shortly after set. Again he thought he saw a star, equal in splendor to the sun, which illuminated the whole world. When he awoke, he related his dream to his father, who expounded it in this manner. From the posterity of your brother, a boy shall be born in the 3rd generation, who shall be the conqueror of the world. Tumena Khan then gave orders for a grand feast, to which he invited all the nobles and principal persons. During the feast, the brothers, having embraced each other, entered into an agreement, which was drawn up in the Turkish language and engraved on a plate of steel, and which was deposited in the treasury. The subject of the agreement was this, that the posterity of the 2 brothers should never quarrel with each other, that the dignity of Khan should forever remain in the descendants of Kublai Khan, and that of Sepa Salah, commander-in-chief and prime minister in the family of Kajuli. In AH 549, Mungu Bahadur, son of Kublai Khan, had a boy, born with his 2 hands full of blood, to whom he gave the name of Timuji. When this personage arrived at the age of 49, after much toil and danger, he was seated on the throne of Turkestan. On the day that he took the title of Khan, a dervish entered the assembly and proclaimed, "The Lord hath said to me, I have given the surface of the earth to Timuji, and I confer on you the title of Genghis Khan, that is to say, King of Kings." But Genghis abandoned the duty of a conqueror by slaughtering the people and by plundering the dominions of God, and put to death many thousands of the Mussulmans. On the morning of the day that he died, he bestowed the sovereignty of Mavaralnagar on his eldest son Jagtai Khan. He appointed Karacha Nuyan, son of Aizdumjin Berlas, son of Kajuli Bahadur, who is my 4th and your 5th ancestor, to be generalissimo and prime minister, and caused the agreement entered into by Kajuli and Kublai Khan to be brought from the treasury and given to them. Jagtai, having perused it, delivered it to Karacha Nuyan and conferred on him the title of Gurgan or Kirkan, great prince. When God had bestowed on Karacha Nuyan a son, he called him Anshel Nuyan. Karacha was not at first one of the true believers, but followed the religion of the Marjasi materialists, who say that God is in everything and in every person. He was, however, anxious to acquire a proper knowledge of God, and therefore sought the acquaintance of all holy men. At length he asked the opinion of one of those learned personages who was descended from Muhammad, "What do the Mussulmans say respecting the true knowledge of God?" The holy man replied, "The faith of the Mussulmans is this, that from all eternity there has existed an omnipotent and omniscient being. He is our God, and he is the God of all creatures. It is therefore not proper to say, as the materialists do, for there is only one God, the creator of all things. We deny a plurality of gods and assert that there is only one." Karacha, after some reflection, said, "It is true, God can have no partner, he is all-sufficient." He then submitted himself to the holy man as a convert and repeated the creed after his preceptor, Vizi. "There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. Glory be to him who is eternal, omniscient and omnipotent, the all-seeing, the all-hearing, the giver of speech, the causer of all events. Praise be also to his messenger Muhammad, who by the miracle of dividing the moon evinced he was the true prophet. He is the minister of the glorious God, and the caliphs are his viziers. From that time Kerachar became firm in his faith and invited all the people to imitate his example, in consequence of which the religion of Muhammad increased and became current through all that region. He also divided the country of Iran equally between the different clans and appointed the plains of Kesh for the residents of the tribe of Berlas, his own tribe, giving them the water, the grass, and pasturage of that and several other places for their support. Kerachar then took on him the business of generalissimo and subdued the countries of Kashgar, of Badakhshan, Andajan, and Hasar, also parts of Khorasan, which he retained as his own private territory. When Kerachar departed this life, he was succeeded by his eldest son Amir Ailtekuz as generalissimo, who conquered several countries. When your grandfather Amir Burkul succeeded as Sepa Salah, finding that there were dissensions among the tribes and clans, he was disgusted, and having retired from his office, contented himself with the government of his own clan of Berlas. He, however, possessed an incalculable number of sheep and goats, of cattle, of slaves and servants. On the death of your grandfather, Amir Burkul, I succeeded to his possessions, but I preferred the company of the learned and the religious persons, and associated mostly with them, frequently soliciting their blessings and prayers that the Almighty God would bestow on me a son, which should raise the fame and increase the dignity of the tribe of Berlas. About this time, a celebrated astrologer came from Fars to Mavaralnahar, and one day, when seated in the assembly of the learned personages, he said, "From the revolution of the heavens it is well known to me that in the year 730 of the Hejira a child shall be born, who will prove the conqueror of the world." Verse, in the year 730, on the 9th of the month, Rejeb, a star of auspicious title shall arise. God hath bestowed this boy on you. When my father had related all these circumstances to me, I was convinced in my own mind that I was born to succeed to the sovereignty, and believed myself endued with all the requisite abilities. I became, however, very religious, constantly prayed to God for success, and made numerous offerings of cattle and sheep to the Sayyids, the learned and devout personages. Thus I sent an offering of 20 sheep to the Saint Amir Kalal, but in consequence of heavy rain they missed the road, and I thought were lost. But some days after having gone to pay my respects to him, I saw the sheep standing at his door, and returned thanks to God that my offering had been accepted. As soon as the saint cast his eyes on me, he said to the bystanders, "The sovereignty of the territories of God has been bestowed on this young Turk." He then began to say his prayers. I also imitated his example. After he had finished his devotions, he said, "Good fortune and royalty is to be your fate, provided that you support the religion of Islam." At this time I repented of my follies, and left off playing chess. I strictly adhered to the law and followed the dictates of religion. I also made a vow never to injure any creature, and whenever I did so by chance, was very sorry for it. Thus one day, having unintentionally trodden on an ant, I felt as if my foot had lost all its power. I constantly begged the intercession of the first caliphs, and was benevolent to all mankind. 1355. In the year 756, I attained my 20th year, and having reached the age of maturity, my father Teragay made over to me a number of tents, sheep, camels, slaves, servants, and attendants, from which during this year I gained much profit. The first arrangement I made of my private affairs was this. I gave the command of 18 slaves to one slave, to whom I gave the title of An Bashi, and I named every 20 horses a tavile stable, and every 100 camels a kutar string, and every 1,000 sheep a gila flock, and gave each of these in charge of a particular slave, and allotted to each of them a certain share of the profits. During this year I was again very unwell, and a physician of Samarkand having administered pomegranates to me, I was seized with a violent palpitation and became quite insensible, upon which my father and mother and all the attendants wept bitterly. After this, a physician of Turkestan seared me with a hot iron, upon which I came to myself. They afterwards gave me some yelmak broth and other food, and I became convalescent. In gratitude for my recovery, I made valuable offerings of sheep and horses. Thus I gave 100 camels in honor of the Prophet, and 50 more in honor of the illustrious caliphs, and gave ample charities to the poor, the hermits, and dervishes, through whose prayers I entirely recovered. Chapter 4. In this year AD 1356, Amir Kezan Sultan, son of Sur Aglan, held the standard of sovereignty over the tribe of Chagtai, and for 15 years had extended the hand of oppression over the people of Mavaralnaha, and placed his feet out of the path of justice and equity. In consequence of his tyranny, his subjects were in a state of despair, confining themselves to their houses and praying for his death. I was also much incensed by his bad conduct, and felt every inclination to rebel against him, and take revenge of his cruelty, but I could not find any body of consequence to join me, nor, until I had distributed all my wealth among them, could I prevail upon any person to unite with me, whilst I was very much affected at the sight of their oppressed state. At length, Amir Kurgan, who was one of the greatest chiefs of the tribe of Jagtay, rebelled against him, and in the year 746, AD 1345, fought with him in the desert of Dera Zengi, but was defeated. The tyrant, having been successful, renewed his oppressions and returned to Kershi. This astonished the people, who expected that Providence would have interfered in their behalf. In consequence of such evil conduct, a Syed of Termuz said that as long as Amir Kazan retains these habits, he will never be conquered. The people therefore began openly to curse him, which only stimulated him to fresh acts of injustice. Some of the effects of the malconduct of this worthless monarch were, firstly, a very severe frost, which destroyed the cattle. Secondly, a total want of rain, in consequence of which the cultivation was quite dried up and the fruits were annihilated. Thirdly, a famine which swept off the people. During the following year, Amir Kurgan, having again recruited his army, advanced towards Kershi, and having engaged the tyrant, defeated and took him prisoner. He at first confined him, but at the end of 2 years put him to death, and relieved the kingdom of Mavaralnaha from his oppressions. Amir Kurgan then took possession of the kingdom, restored much of the property that had been unlawfully seized, and conducted himself with equity. But as the nobles would not acknowledge his authority, I had some intention of taking the sovereignty upon myself. However, the chiefs anticipated my design, and raised Danish Munchi Eglan, one of the descendants of Genghis Khan, to the dignity of Khan, to whom they vowed fidelity, and made him monarch of all Mavaralnaha. Amir Kurgan, with the title of commander, ruled the kingdom in the name of Danish Muncha Khan for the term of 10 years, with great propriety, re-established the laws, and gave encouragement to the Mohammedan religion. A.D. 1357. When I had attained my 21st year, I wished to have united all the tribe of Berlas, and to have rebelled. I was joined by 40 of my schoolfellows, and we consulted upon taking possession of the mountain of Kaan. But at this time my mother was called to the divine mercy, and my sister Turkan Aka took charge of my household. I was for some time very melancholy, and gave up my ambitious intentions. After the days of mourning for my mother were accomplished, my father betrothed me to the daughter of Amir Jaku Berlas. About this time, my father deputed me to Amir Kurgan on some business respecting our tribe and clan, by which means I became acquainted with the Amir, who took a great liking to me, adopted me as his son, and gave me one of his granddaughters in marriage, with great honor and much wealth, and seated me near himself in the assembly. After the death of the Amir, as his son was not equal to the duties of vizier, I had some wish to take the office myself, and had got the consent of several of the chiefs. But recollecting my debt of gratitude to the father, I said to myself, better be patient, and took patience. In this year, I one day went into the desert to hunt. When we came to the hunting ground, a violent storm of both snow and rain came on. Afterwards, the snow being very deep, I lost my road and wandered about. At length I saw something dark. When I approached it, I found it was a hill, at the bottom of which there was a great cave, in which some families of the Arlat clan had taken shelter from the inclemency of the weather, had formed chambers in the rocks of the cave, and had pitched their tents in its vicinity. As I was nearly dead with cold, I got off my horse and entered the cave without ceremony. I there saw a good fire, with a pot well filled with broth hanging thereon. As I was very hungry, the sight of it delighted me. The owner of the room was very kind. He pulled off my coat and boots, which were wet through. He also unbound my quiver, and bringing some horse rugs, made a bed for me. He then brought the hot soup, of which I ate a quantity, and became warm and refreshed. I passed the night there, and in return to the family for their kindness, I took their eldest son home with me, and introduced him to the emir. Another time I went a-hunting and met with a very serious accident. I was pursuing a deer at full speed when I unexpectedly came to a dry well. The horse was very active and attempted to jump the well, but although his 4 feet cleared it, his hind legs fell in. I vaulted from the saddle and tried to get over, but did not succeed, and both horse and man went down. My companions thought I was killed, but when they found me alive, they were much rejoiced and made offerings for my lucky escape, which was considered as a fortunate omen and gained me many followers. A.D. 1358. In the year 757, I reached 22 years of age and began to put in practice some of my speculations regarding the sovereignty, for several of the chiefs of the tribes and clans, being dissatisfied with Emir Kurgan, conspired together and wrote to me that if I would encourage them, they would be my friends and would displace both the Emir and the Khan, after which we might divide the country between us. But I, having reflected that it would be much easier at some future time to dispossess one person than to have to contend with 10 rivals, and recollecting the friendly connection that existed between the Emir and me, I determined to inform him of the circumstance. But the chiefs, having discovered my intentions, wrote to the Emir in the Turkey language, "Be it known to your enlightened mind that every body selects some powerful personage to be his patron, through whose mediation he may obtain the object of his desires and wishes. We, in order to obtain our desires and wishes, have chosen your benevolence and kindness to be our intermediators. We have taken the liberty of representing this. May your prosperity endure forever." When this letter reached the Emir, as he was a very weak man, he, in a kind and friendly manner, invited the chiefs to wait on him and paid no regard to the caution I had given him. In consequence of this invitation, the chiefs, having collected their men and having put on their armor, came to the palace gate, between the hours of evening prayer and bedtime. The Emir immediately sent for me. When I came to the gate, I spoke to several of the chiefs, and finding that they had armor under their clothes, I suspected that they had evil intentions, bade them good evening, went into the palace, and told the Emir all the circumstances, who, on hearing of the treachery and the mutinous state of his officers, was seized with a pain in his bowels. He therefore sent them an apology, but gave orders for their being hospitably entertained and permitted to return to their camp. He then consulted me how we were to get rid of them. I advised him to deceive them by presents. He, in consequence, sent a large sum of money and desired them to divide it among them according to their rank. As the sum was large, they could not agree on the division, and soon began to quarrel, after which they came singly to ask the Emir's pardon and to be again admitted into favor. Thus enmity was changed into friendship, and the danger was averted. On this occasion the Emir again took me in his arms, called me his son, and bestowed on me the district of Shemergin. A.D. 1360. In the year 759, I attained my 23rd year. At this time, Emir Kurgan, being quite absolute in the kingdom of Mavaralnahar, resolved to subdue the kingdom of Khwarizm, and in this affair offered to give me the command of the expedition. I at first agreed, but after deliberation, I thought it advisable that the command should be given to some other person, who might be defeated by the Khwarezmians, after which I would then enter the country and subdue it. I therefore spoke privately to Emir Kaiser that he would request Bayan Kuli, who was one of the lords of the council, to say to the prince that Khwarezm, being an easy conquest, ought to be assigned to His Highness's eldest son Abdullah, whose fame would be exalted thereby, and all the credit given to him instead of Timur. Bayan Kuli having explained these circumstances to Emir Kurgan, he approved of the measure, and ordered his eldest son Abdullah from Samarkand to take command of the army against Khwarezm. Abdullah entered the country, but the Khwarezmians, having strengthened their fortresses, kept him at bay and reduced him to great distress. The emir, not knowing what to do, sent for me and said, "From the first it was my wish to have given the command of the army to you, and still it is my wish that you should take it." I reflected within myself that the emir wished for my assistance to effect the conquest, but that he meant to keep all the benefit to himself. I therefore thought I might as well make the conquest for myself and become sovereign of the country. As ambition is a very powerful passion, I resolved no longer to be subservient to anyone, but to go and take Khwarezm for myself. When Emir Kurgan had superseded his son and put under my command a large force, I marched towards Khwarezm, but I ordered that the army of Abdullah should remain stationary till my arrival. As the Khwarezmians would not engage us in the field, but shut themselves up in their fortresses, the first thing I did was this. I made overtures to the chiefs of all the wandering tribes and clans that inhabited Khwarezm, and having united them to me, I requested them to intercede with the governors of the forts. They did so, and they all agreed to be my servants. I then divided amongst them the whole of the countries of Khwarezm and Aurkunje. Having thus gotten possession of all the fortresses of the kingdom, I appointed a confidential person of my own to be Kutwal, superintendent of them, and thus settled the government of the country. I also wished to have raised the standard of sovereignty, but having no dependence on the fealty of my new subjects, I returned with Abdullah to the emir, who in return for my successful conduct gave me the country of Aurkunje. A.D. 1358. In the year 760, I attained my 24th year. About this time, Emir Kurgan made a grand hunting party and came out of Samarkand. Whilst we were engaged in the chase, night came on. Kutlug Timur Khan, the son-in-law of the prince, having a number of wicked wretches united with him, judged it a favourable opportunity to assassinate the emir, seeing that I and the chief huntsman were his only companions. He, therefore, made an attack on him with 7 expert swordsmen. At this time it was dark, but I, hearing them, called out and threatening them, threw myself between them and the prince, who immediately alighted from his horse, and drawing his sword, got behind a large stone. The huntsman then joining us, Kutlug Timur ran off. In reward for saving him from this peril, the emir bestowed on me the revenue of Hissa Shadman. Being now master of the countries of Khwarezm and Shadman, I divided the revenues with my soldiers. But although I was very kind and liberal to all my servants, they would not support me in my ambitious views. The eyes of Emir Kurgan being now open to the designs of his son-in-law, he left off hunting and watched an opportunity of seizing him and his companions with the intention of putting them to death. But Kutlug, being aware of his intention, took refuge in the highlands of Mavaralnahar and became a public robber. At length, the daughter of the emir, who was married to this fellow, pretended to become insane from the absence of her husband. As the emir was a weak and compassionate man, he listened to the deceit of women, and believed that his daughter was really mad, and the other women joining with her led him astray, and prevailed on him to pardon Kutlug Timur, in consequence of which an edict was issued for him to return to court. I opposed this measure, and said to the emir, "Do not be led away by your women, for God hath said, always act contrary to what women advise. If they have told you not to put him to death, undoubtedly kill him. For according to the orders of God, you should oppose them in everything, for they are deficient in sense." Although the emir knew his son-in-law to be his inveterate enemy, he would not at first follow the advice of the proverb, which I repeated to him, viz., Keep your enemy in your grasp as you would a ruby, till you come to a flinty spot, then knock his head against the stone till you dash it to pieces. But at length he listened to my opinion, and determined to crush his enemy. He, however, did not find an opportunity. In this same year, Emir Kurgan one day sent for me, and having repeated his complaints, said, he was resolved to divorce his daughter and son-in-law, but his women again rendered him subservient to their orders, and Kutlug-Timur pretending to be sorry for what he had done, the divorce was postponed. About this time, Emir Kurgan took the government of Andijan from Sultan Kuli, the father of his son Abdullah's wife, and gave it to Khwaja Ezdi, in consequence of which the deposed governor bound up the loins of enmity against his master, and conspired with Kutlug-Timur, and agreed to set up the young Abdullah. I frequently cautioned the emir against them, and as he had been pleased to adopt me as a son, and had given me a written promise that I should be his successor in the kingdom of Mavar-al-Nahar, I watched over him as a child should over a parent, and omitted no part of my duty towards him. Till at length the Emir Kurgan, who was extremely fond of hunting, one day went out, without me, attended only by a few persons without their armour, and having crossed the Oxus, Jihun was deeply engaged in the chase, when Kutlug-Timur and Sultan Kuli attacked and murdered the just prince. When I was informed of the circumstance, I was dreadfully affected. I repaired immediately to the spot where the body was lying, and having respectfully taken it up, I transported it to the banks of the river, and there purified it, after which we carried it to Salih Sarai, and there buried it. Immediately after this event, Kutlug-Timur and Sultan Kuli placed Abdullah, eldest son of the murdered prince, in the government, but took the oath of allegiance to Bian Kuli, the Khan, whom the deceased emir had set up, and promised to support him in his nominal dignity, provided he would employ Abdullah as his vizier. The whole party then proceeded towards Samarkand, but on their arrival there, they put the innocent and harmless Khan to death. As the vizier Abdullah was a miser, who took from everyone and gave to nobody, and who had thrown the eyes of cupidity on the wealth of the two murdered personages, the emir and the Khan, the conspirators elevated Timur Shah Aglan, son of Munsur Timur, to the Khanship. They then attacked the party of Abdullah and fought 3 battles with them. But Abdullah, having swam his horse across the Jihun, took refuge in the country of Kutalan and Andarab, where he died. Chapter 6. 1359. In the year 760, having attained my 24th year, being much disgusted with the infamous conduct of Kutlug-Timur and Sultan Kuli, and being without any other remedy, I mounted my horse and proceeded to the Ulus tribe of Bayan Seldus, and implored him to join me in taking revenge on the murderers of the late Amir and Khan. He agreed to unite with me, and we put on the swords of revenge. Although the fortress of Shadman belonged to me, yet I divided with Bayan Seldus in a brotherly manner, and gave him possession of it in order to secure his cooperation, and to prove to mankind that the murderers of kings should always suffer retaliation. I also prevailed on Haji Berlas, a descendant of Kerachar Nuyan, to join us in revenging the death of the emir and the Khan. I therefore drew my troops out of Samarkand and proceeded towards Kesh. When arrived in its vicinity, I sent to Haji Berlas, who came and joined me. We then agreed to proceed to Samarkand and to depose Timur Khan from the Khanship. In compliance with this determination, we marched with all our forces to Samarkand and dethroned Timur Khan and took possession of the whole kingdom of Mavar-al-Nahar, and we 3 persons divided it between us. I got possession of Kesh with its dependencies and fixed my residence there. Thus, we 3 persons ruled the country of Mavar-al-Nahar like 3 brothers, and whenever any noble, soldier, or citizen proved disobedient, we united in punishing him. We agreed very well together, and divided the revenues in a brotherly manner, till at length Bayan Seldus, from excess of drinking, suddenly bade adieu to this world. I then said to Haji Berlas, "Shall we divide the portion of Seldus between us, or shall we give it to his son, so that his troops may remain faithful and things may go on as usual?" But he would not listen to this, and seized on some part of the share of Seldus, in consequence of which violent disputes took place between the followers of Seldus and him. When this intelligence reached the ears of the surrounding chiefs, each of them exalted the standard of sovereignty, but I continued to govern my own country quietly and with regularity. About this time, several disturbances broke out in Mavralnaha, on which occasion both the nobles and plebeians of Turan came to me and explained their situation, saying, "There is now no king in this country, and the petty tyrants harass us. We are resolved to abandon the country till some person is placed on the throne of power who can protect us." On hearing this, my ambition was roused, and I wished to take possession of the whole kingdom and become absolute sovereign of it, but I found that I could place no reliance on the support of the people. I therefore thought it better for the present to keep on terms with the different chiefs who had independence, and endeavor to throw the ball of discord among them, so that by degrees I might bring each of them under my subjection. But to effect this, I saw that patience, perseverance, and divine aid were requisite. During this same year, which was A.A. H. 760, I began to take measures for extirpating these petty princes of Mavralnaha, Muluk al-Tuef, and I wrote to each of them a separate letter requesting them to join me and that we should divide the country in a brotherly manner between us two. They all gave a favorable answer to my letters, but none of them were aware of my correspondence with the others. Having thus excited the ambition and cupidity of each of them, and having agreed that whatever country should be subdued was to be equally divided between the parties, they individually bound themselves with the girdle of fealty to me. This was in fact a very important affair, for Elchi Buga Seldus had raised the standard of royalty in bulk. Amir Bayezid Jelaya had taken possession of Kujand. Khwaja Izdi had established himself in Shumerganat. The kings of Badakhshan were contending with each other in the mountains of that province. Haikusero and Altajaberdi had seized upon Kutalan and Arheng, and Khiza Yusuri was in possession of all the country from the bridge of Tashkund to the vicinity of Samarkand. Now, to take the kingdom from such chiefs, each of whom vied in splendor with the other, was indeed a difficult undertaking, but I resolved to do it by setting them at loggerheads. I therefore wrote to Elchi Buga that the inhabitants of Badakhshan had complained to me of their rulers, and had requested me to proceed thither to relieve them, that I had determined to do so, and, if he would join me, that country should be annexed to his dominion. Otherwise, as it was my duty to administer justice to the oppressed, I should do everything in my power to assist them. When he received my letter, he immediately drew out his army to attack the kings of Badakhshan, and they forthwith sought refuge with me, and offered, if I would deliver them from their peril, they would make over the whole country to me and become my subjects. I also wrote to Haji Izdi, the ruler of Shemagan, that the province of Balkh being now unoccupied, I had sent an army to take possession of it, but that if he had any ambition to partake of the conquest, he might become my partner in this business. This roused him, and he immediately invaded Balkh. When this intelligence reached the ears of Seldus, he returned from Badakhshan and came to Hisar Shadman and Balkh. And the kings of Badakhshan bound the girdle of fealty around their loins, and promised that whenever or wherever I should summon them, they would attend me with all their followers. When Seldus entered the province of Balkh, Haji Saizdi of Shemagan drew out his army and engaged him, but, being defeated, sought refuge with me. Having thus made him one of my dependents, I drove out Seldus and restored Shemagan to him. This same year, Amir Husin, the grandson of Emir Kurgan, who sought the inheritance of his grandfather, marched from Kabul with all his tribe and followers and came towards Mavralnaha. He also wrote me a letter requesting my assistance. As his sister was one of my wives, the sinews of my affection were put in motion. I therefore encouraged him to advance towards Mavralnaha. This, in fact, was the greatest error I committed during my whole reign, for I thus admitted into my friendship a person of vile disposition, proud and miserly. But I, being then ignorant of his character, advised him to invade Badakhshan, which he did, and made himself master of that country. In this year, 760, a son was born to me. As he was my first, I named him Muhammad, after the Prophet, upon whom and upon his descendants be the grace of God. And, as it occurred at a period when I was very successful, I considered it an auspicious omen, and added Jahangir, conqueror of the world. I also gave a grand feast, to which all the principal inhabitants of Mavar-al-Nahar came, except two of the nobility. The first was Emir Bayezid Jelaya, the other Emir Haji Berlas. I, however, did not show any displeasure, but acted kindly to all their dependents and followers, which induced them to take my part, in consequence of which the tribe of Berlas, which was under the command of Emir Haji, but who were disgusted with his conduct, repaired to me. Also his wife's father, ambitious of getting the command of the tribe for his grandson, by which he himself would get the power into his own hands, attempted to assassinate him. But the emir, having discovered the plot, sent the scoundrel to hell. He then came to consult me whether he should destroy the family. I told him that to take revenge upon children would be highly improper, and only cause poverty and distress. In this same year, A.A. Shai 760, Emir Husain got possession of the whole kingdom of Badakhshan, and took prisoners 3 of the princes of the country, heirs of the former kings, whom his minister, Mahmud Yusuri, very unjustly put to death, but the revenge of their blood seized hold on the skirts of Emir Husain, and their heirs obtained legal retaliation on him, as will be hereafter mentioned. Chapter 7. When I reached my 25th year, Tughleq Timur Khan, the descendant of Genghis Khan, who was absolute sovereign of the Desht Jitta, advanced towards Mavar-al-Nahar with the intention of subduing it, and encamped on the banks of the Kujend River, from whence he sent me an imperial edict to summon all the chiefs to his presence. A.D. 1360. Haji Berlas, being much frightened, consulted me what we should do in regard to opposing Tughleq Timur. I said, "It is advisable that we should wait on him in person, but let us send our tribes and hordes to the south side of the Jihun, towards Khorasan, that after he has entered Mavar-al-Nahar, we shall see whether he intends to remain. If he stops there, he will then lay the province waste, but if he does not intend keeping possession, we will attend his court." After much argument, it was at length agreed that I should wait on Tughleq Timur with my own people, and, by my ingenuity, endeavor to preserve the country from being plundered, because policy is often superior to the sword. It was also determined that Haji Berlas should proceed towards Khorasan with the tribes and clans, whilst I remained behind to protect, if possible, the country, but if not, to follow him. In consequence of this determination, I gave the blessing to Haji Berlas, and sent him off with all the tribes and hordes, but escorted them 2 or 3 days' journey, after which I returned alone and took up my residence at Kesh. Emir Bayezid, having explained the order to his tribe, marched with them to meet Tughleq Timur. At this time my father Teragay was taken very ill, and in order to attend on him, I was obliged to postpone my visit to Tughleq Timur. But when the decreed hour had arrived, my honored parent resigned his life and bade adieu to the world. I buried him in an honorable manner in the vicinity of Kesh, the burying ground of the holy men, Aulia. After this event, all the principal inhabitants of Mavar-al-Nahar waited on me, and by agreement said, "We are 12,000 cavaliers. We wish you to accept the sovereignty, and if you permit, we will read the khutbah in your name, for it is written in the rules of government that whoever has 12,000 cavaliers true and faithful to him, should he not raise the standard of royalty, ought to be reckoned inglorious." As I knew that this proposal of theirs proceeded entirely from fear of Tughleq, and that no dependence is to be placed on stipendiaries or needy followers till tried by experience, I merely contented myself by assuring them there was no danger, and consequently no necessity for this imprudent measure. At this time I received a second summons from Tughleq Timur. I therefore explained to the chiefs and principal persons of Mavar-al-Nahar that the coming of Tughleq Timur was an unexpected calamity, and it would be better, as the Geats are noted for avarice, to satiate them by presents and induce them to refrain from murder and rapine. Soon after this, the first division of the Yeats, commanded by Mahmud Yusuri, entered Mavar-al-Nahar in great force, with the intention of plundering and laying waste the country, and encamped at Heraz. I therefore assembled my own people, and taking with me the principal personages and a number of curiosities and valuable presents, I proceeded towards the Jet army. When I arrived at Heraz, I met the General Mahmud Yusuri, and we embraced on horseback. We then proceeded to his tent, where he entertained me. After dinner, I presented him a number of valuable articles and requested that he would halt where he was while I should proceed to the next division of the army and visit the other officers. I accordingly marched forward to the Heravel, and in the plains of Keshem I waited on the commander-in-chief, Amir al-Omra, and other generals. They all came forward to meet me and received me in the most gracious manner and praised me exceedingly. I deceived them also by rich presents and prevailed on them to halt in the desert till I should have paid my respects to the Khan. The three generals agreed to my request, considered my visit as an auspicious omen, and wrote in my favor to their master. At length I paid my respects to Tughlaq-Timur while encamped on the banks of the Kujend, and the chiefs of the tribes and principal persons of the country had the honor of saluting him, Kurnish, and of making him their numerous offerings. When the Khan was informed that the generals of the advanced divisions had taken valuable presents from the inhabitants of Mavar-al-Nahar, he was incensed and ordered all the presents to be confiscated and deposited in his treasury. This order gave great offense to the officers, and they vowed vengeance against him. At this time, intelligence was brought that the officers of the army in Jeddah had raised the standard of rebellion against Tughlaq-Timur. He therefore consulted me, saying, "Shall I march against the mutineers in person, or shall I send an army to subdue them?" I replied, "In going yourself to the desert, there is only one danger to be apprehended, but by sending an army and not going in person, there are two to be feared." The emperor was much gratified by this advice, and in order to subdue the mutinous officers, returned towards the desert. And he gave me the command of the Tuman tribe of Kerashah and the government of Mavar-al-Nahar, with permission to return, in consequence of which all the people of that country, both great and small, soldier and citizen, considered themselves under great obligations to me, and offered up thanksgivings and prayers for my success, in recompense for my having, through the grace of God, averted such a calamity from them. Amir Jalaya, who with his people had also paid their respects to the Khan, came and joined me. Thus I became absolute master of all Mavar-al-Nahar. I then compelled all the nomade tribes to conform to my regulations, and I took up my abode in the city of Kesh, called also Sheher-Subz, or Verdant City. Chapter 8. About this time, A.H. 762, the Sayyids, the prelates, and the learned, and other principal persons of Mavar-al-Nahar waited upon me, and requested that I would permit them to read the Khutbah royal proclamation in my name, but I desired them to postpone doing so, for I reflected within myself that it was first requisite to clear the country from thieves and robbers, and bring all the nomad tribes into perfect subjection, after which it would be easy to have the Khutbah read and have the coins struck in my own name. At this time I received a letter from the Jet General, Amir Kaiser Yusuri, informing me that he was coming with all his tribe to become my subjects. I was much rejoiced that he should thus voluntarily submit to my authority, and was convinced that the standard of my sovereignty was daily rising more and more. A.D. 1361. When in this year I had attained the age of 26, Amir Hussein, the grandson of Amir Kurgan, whom I had encouraged to the invasion of Badakhshan, attacked the fort of Shadman, belonging to Mian Selduz, and requested my assistance. In consequence of our family connection, I agreed to assist him. I sent a division of troops under the command of Kaiser Yusuri to join him. A few days afterwards I marched with my own division. When Seldus was informed of my movements, finding himself unequal to contend against such a force, he evacuated the fortress of Shadman and fled into Badakhshan. When intelligence of these events reached Bahadin, the legitimate prince of that country, He fled to the mountains, and Amir Husin with little difficulty got possession of all Badakhshan. Amir Husin was, however, jealous of my movement, and when I arrived at Shadman, fearing that I would take the lion's share, he wrote me a letter of thanks, stating that owing to my assistance, he had gotten possession not only of the fortress, but also of all the plain country of Badakhshan. He therefore requested that I would not take the trouble of advancing any farther, and that I would have the goodness to return to my capital, but that I was master and might do as I liked, that he should ever consider himself under the greatest obligations and reckon Badakhshan as a gift from me. At this time, Kikubad, brother of Kikusru Kutalani, who was called the murderer of kings, for he had put to death the king of Badakhshan, waited on me and began to flatter me, but as I had no confidence in him, I put him to death. When I received Amir Husin's letter, I acted in a friendly manner to him, but I appointed Kaiser Usuri, whom I esteemed as my right arm, to the command of the fortress of Shadman, and returned to my capital, which was the city of Subs, and there took up my abode. Some time after this, I sent an invitation to Kaiser Usuri to come from Shadman and visit me. After the course of a fortnight, he, having previously received valuable presents from Amir Husin, came to me. I received him as my guest, gave him a grand entertainment, and having attached him to me, sent him back to Shadman. About this time an ambassador came to me, sent by Amir Husin, to represent that he was in great distress and solicited my assistance, for that me and Seldus had attacked him, that the people of Badakhshan had deserted him, that he feared every day being seized, and that his only chance of safety was my marching to his aid. The sinews of my honor being thus touched, I ordered an army to march immediately from Subs towards Badakhshan, and I sent letters to Amir Bayezid and Kaiser Usuri to proceed immediately to the assistance of Amir Husin. The former delayed, but the other very shortly joined him. During this time I proceeded towards Badakhshan, and when arrived at Derbund Aheni, the Iron Gate, intelligence was brought me that Seldus, having got possession of the fortress of Shadman, had turned out my governor Kaiser. I bent the reins of my horse, and contrary to the advice of my father-in-law, continued my march with all expedition, determined on revenging this insult. When Seldus was informed of my approach, finding himself inadequate to oppose so considerable a force, and fearful of falling into my hands, he quitted the fortress and took refuge among the mountains of Badakhshan. I then reinstalled Kaiser Usuri in the fort of Shadman, and placed the citadel in the hands of Tash Khwaja for him. Being thus reconciled with Husin, and after having taken hostages from him, I returned towards my capital. When I arrived at the plain of Akyar, near the city of Kesh, intelligence was brought that Haji Berlas had returned from Khorasan, but he, having been informed of my approach, had encamped in the neighborhood, intending to oppose me. On this, I gave my cavalry orders to advance in 7 successive charges, but on seeing them, Haji fled to Samarkand and took refuge with Jalaya. I pursued him, and having taken some of his followers, was induced by their entreaties to forgive him, but he refused my forgiveness and fled across the Jihun. The 5th time that the hateful Haji returned from Khorasan, he was cut off by the villagers in the desert of that country. Thus, for refusing my mercy, he lost his life in a foreign land. Chapter 9. The scheme which Haji Berlas and Bayezid Jalaya had laid for me was this: that having joined their forces and encamped in the plains of Kesh, they should give out that they were going to invade Khujend. They were then to inveigle me to the camp, and having murdered me, take possession of the district of Subs. In consequence of this arrangement, they sent me a letter, stating that as they had resolved to subdue the country of Khujend, if I would join in this enterprise, it would be very advantageous to all. As I was not aware of their treacherous intentions, and considered them Mussulmans, I placed confidence in them, and set out to join them. When I reached the plains of Kesh, I saw a great number of handsome tents pitched, and a regular encampment formed. When I approached the camp, Bayezid came out to meet me, and to do me honor, he took my hand and first led me into the public tent. Baga. He then said, As we must have some confidential conversation, and the time is short, we had better go to the private tent, Kurga, and he led the way. When we entered the Kurga, I saw that the carpet was raised up in a particular part, and when I advanced, it appeared to me that there was a well there which they had covered over with felt. Suspicion seized my mind. I delayed to sit down, and was convinced that treachery was intended. At this time, Bayezid sat down on my right hand, and Berlas on my left hand. I then pretended that I was seized with a bleeding of the nose. I drew out my handkerchief and applied it to my nose, and immediately walked from the private into the public tent. I proceeded through it till I was joined by all my officers, as they were well armed. They sounded the trumpets, and we returned to our own camp. Bayezid was afterwards ashamed of his conduct, and laid all the blame on Berlas. At this time, Mir Syed Ali of Termuz, who was one of the most learned and devout personages of the age, cursed them both for me, saying, "O Lord, cast down the evil-doers to the lowest pit of hell." His prayer was heard, and God afterwards caused these two scoundrels to quarrel with each other, by which means I was delivered from their malice and treachery. Immediately after this act of baseness, the camp broke up. The allies marched towards Kujend, and I set out for Termuz. When I arrived at this city, Sheikh Ali Jahiri, suspecting that I intended to seize that country and subdue the nomade hordes, drew out his forces against me. As Sheikh Ali was one of the learned persons, and had formerly been one of my companions, I did not wish to quarrel with him. Therefore, when he had assembled all his tribe and connections, and had taken post in Old Termuz, I sent an agent to remind him that he was under great obligations to me, and that, if he opposed me, the debt of ingratitude would certainly overwhelm him, that we had long been companions, that it was I who raised him to the command of his horde, that he had behaved ungratefully, deserted me, and joined Bayezid Jalea. But my words having no effect on him, and he proving unworthy of his salt, I cursed him, and prepared for battle. Sheikh Ali, finding that his followers were more numerous than my soldiers, was puffed up with vanity, and advanced with boldness into the field. I formed my troops into 3 divisions, and made a rapid charge on the enemy. My first division fell among them like a stone among a flock of birds, and they all dispersed. After the flight of the chief, I easily took possession of the horde, whilst the fugitive Ali went and took refuge with Bayezid Jalaya. In the end, God caused him to be a wanderer over the earth, till he came and begged my forgiveness. I pardoned him on account of his name, Ali, as it is a saying of the wise, that when an enemy comes before you as a suppliant and bends his knees, one should return thanks to God for having reduced him to his dilemma. Chapter 10. In the year A.H. 763, I entered my 27th year, on which occasion the great and the little, the chiefs of the villages of the hordes and tribes of all Mavaralnaha, paid their respects to me, and humbly represented that they had no monarch who would redress their wrongs. For in every district and every town there was some tyrant who unjustly plundered them and seized on the property of the Mussulmans. Their patience was quite exhausted, and that they should certainly abandon the country unless some sovereign was placed on the throne who would protect them. In consequence of this representation, I wrote a letter to Amir Hussin, his brother-in-law, who was then in possession of Badukhshan, asking him if he had the courage to join me in clearing the country of Mavaralnaha from all its petty tyrants, and in relieving the wretched servants of God from the hands of their brutal oppressors, that if he would do so, we might then divide the kingdom in a brotherly manner, and thereby gain great fame and celebrity. He promised to do so, but immediately began to enter into treacherous schemes against me, wishing first to overset me and then to subdue the other petty princes. Finding Amir Hussin thus bent upon my ruin, and that I had evident proofs of his treachery, I wrote a letter to Tughlaq Timur Khan, prince of the Jaits, and a descendant of Genghis Khan, who was the absolute sovereign of Tartary, stating that the country of Mavaralnaha was now desolate, and only inhabited by kites and crows, but that if he would assist me, I would render it productive. A.D. 1362. As soon as my letter reached the Khan, He drew out his forces and marched with an innumerable army towards Mavaralnaha. And when he arrived on the bank of the Sihon-Kujan River, he sent me a letter stating that he was encamped with his innumerable and valiant army on the banks of the Kujan, that I should join him, but in the meantime inform him what further measures were advisable. At this time, Bayezid Jalaya put on the girdle of loyalty and advanced to pay his respects to his sovereign, but leaving the city of Samarkand under charge of a deputy. As soon as he was presented at court, the keys of the city were demanded from him, and as he delayed giving them up, the Khan ordered that his head should be struck off. This was immediately carried into execution, and the head was sent to Samarkand. Haji Berlas, who at first intended to oppose the Khan, was so terrified by the punishment of Bayezid that he took to flight and sought refuge in the city of Kesh, but sent orders to his horde and his dependents to leave the country. He now repented of his conduct to me, acknowledged his folly, and asked my forgiveness, and then went across the Jihan. At this time, Tughleq Timur Khan detached a part of the army of Jeteh to pursue the horde of Haji Berlas, and a great battle took place between the contending parties on the banks of the Jihun. On this occasion, Chugam Berlas, who was one of the Omrahs of that tribe, highly distinguished himself, and so occupied the royal army as to enable the tribe with their cattle to cross the river in safety, except himself, who, while defending the rear guard, was cut down by some of the soldiers of Jeteh. In the meantime, Haji Berlas crossed the river in safety and marched the horde towards Khorasan. When he entered that country, he behaved unkindly to the inhabitants and began to be guilty of oppression and injustice. He also exacted tribute from the wandering tribes of Sebzwa, on which account several skirmishes took place, and the villagers, having by surprise seized Aidku Bahadur, the brother of Haji Berlas, put him to death. They also seized the Haji and put an end to his existence. As I was at that period in possession of Khorasan, I assigned the district of Jeza for the support of the dependents and followers of the Haji. When the letter of Tughleq Timur desiring my immediate presence reached me, it was also reported that Amir Hamid, who was the Khan's chief counselor, had said to him, "In every town and district of Mavaralnaha there is a separate ruler. They have at least 30,000 cavalry among them, to oppose whom we have been obliged to make numerous detachments. It is, therefore, quite requisite that you should prevail on Amir Timur to join you, for if he should unite with these petty rulers, they will be too many for us. We must, therefore, hasten his arrival, and as he is a very sensible man, let us consult him on the best measures to be pursued." It was in consequence of this advice that the Khan wrote me a brother-like letter, which induced me to make immediate preparations for joining him. The determination that I made on the subject of visiting Tughleq Timur was this. I resolved to write letters to all the principal inhabitants, heads of villages, elders of the tribes and hordes of Mavaralnaha, stating to them that whoever wished to save his life and property from being destroyed and plundered by the armies of Jeteh should immediately repair to me, but those who declined this offer ought to quit the country without loss of time. In consequence of this invitation, the greater number of the chiefs and principal inhabitants came to me, bringing with them a number of curiosities and presents. As soon as they were all assembled, I proceeded with them and all my own soldiers and dependents, carrying various presents, and paid my respects to the Khan emperor on the banks of the Kujind River. He received me most graciously, and when he saw the presents, his eyes were satiated. He then consulted me what was requisite to be done. I told him that I had agreed for so many thousand durists as the revenue of Mavaralnaha, and that he had only to appoint collectors to realize the portion of each district and to punish those who refused payment. He approved of my advice, and after he had taken possession of the throne of Mavaralnaha, he again consulted me on the best mode of preserving his authority. I said to him, "Sovereignty is like a tent, the poles of which should be justice, the ropes equity, and the pins philanthropy, in order that it may stand firm against the blasts of adversity." He was much pleased with this metaphor, and I continued, "You must secure the soldiers of this country in the bonds of kindness, that if they survive the war, you may find them act like men, and if killed, they may die in your service. I further said, "The good of Mavar-al-Nahar are very good, and the bad are very bad. Do you reward the good with goodness, and leave the bad alone, for evil shall overtake the wicked." At this time, intelligence was brought that the Emir Husin had collected a very large army in Badakhshan. On hearing this, the Khan was ashamed of his former conduct to me, asked my pardon, and gave me the entire command of all the country and all the hordes of Mavar-al-Nahar, with the city of Subs and the Samarganat as far as the city of Balkh. He also left me in full possession of all my hereditary rights over my own tribe of Burlas and other clans. As it was now certain that Emir Husin was resolved to oppose Tughlaq-Timur and had boldly advanced as far as the river Vahesh for that purpose, the Khan became thoughtful and asked my advice. I said to him, "The state of the case is this, as in addition to the forces of Badakhshan, Emir Husin has been joined by the rulers of Kutalan and Bakerlan. He therefore feels bold enough to contend with you. The best plan is this: send the commission of governor of the fortress of Shadman and of the district of Kutalan to Kai Kuseru, the chief who commands the first line of Emir Husin." The Khan approved of this advice, sent off the commission by a trusty messenger, and then marched towards the enemy. When he reached the Iron Gate and had pitched his camp, the advance guard of Emir Husin came in sight. The Khan immediately ordered his advance under Beg Chuk to oppose the enemy. But when the two Herevals met, Kai Kuseru deserted with all his followers and joined the imperialists. When Emir Husin saw the state of his first line, he attempted to draw out the remainder of his army, but his right and left wings, being panic-struck, took to flight. Thus, Tughlaq-Timur gained an easy victory, and the army of Jeteh plundered all the hordes and tribes of those districts, whilst Emir Husin retreated towards Samarkand. The mind of the Khan being thus at ease with regard to Emir Husin, he returned to Samarkand, and having entered the city, put to death Mayan Kuli Seldus. And being now in possession of the whole kingdom of Mavar-al-Nahar, all the chiefs of cities and the heads of all the nomad tribes were obliged to submit to his authority, whilst the rebellious and all the petty tyrants who reckoned themselves as sultans were annihilated. A few of them, who had not been guilty of any gross impropriety, were taken into favor and ordered to join my army. A.D. 1363. When the country of Mavar-al-Nahar was thus cleared of all the petty tyrants, I returned thanks to God that what I had wished to do was thus effected by his decree, and all my adversaries punished. At this time I deliberated with myself how I should induce Tughlaq-Timur to quit the country and leave me in possession of it. I therefore suggested to him that Khorasan would now be an easy conquest, that in fact he had only to send his army across the river Amu, Jihun, and that he would meet with no opposition. He approved much of my advice and agreed to leave me in charge of Mavar-al-Nahar, whilst he should proceed to the conquest of Khorasan. About this period, news was brought that in consequence of the divine decree, the chiefs of the Desht Kipchak had rebelled and had raised Beshki-Aglan, another descendant of Genghis, to the khanship. On this occasion, the Khan again consulted me. I said to him, "If you set out immediately and proceed to the Desht before the rebels have gained strength, you may quell them easily and preserve your authority over all the country, but if you procrastinate, you will be overwhelmed in misfortunes and calamities." As he approved of my advice, he was lavish in his praises of my merit and gave me the entire management of Mavar-al-Nahar, but appointed his son Alyas Khwaja the nominal governor. When I objected to this proceeding, he showed me the agreement between our ancestors, Kajuli Bahadur and Kubal Khan, in consequence of which I accepted the office of Sepa Salah, commander-in-chief, and he gave orders to all the officers of Jeteh to be obedient to my authority, after which he set out to quell the mutiny of the troops in the Desht Kipchak. As Alyas Khwaja had no talents for government, the troops of Jeteh soon began to exercise cruelty and injustice over the inhabitants of Mavar-al-Nahar, murdering and plundering the townspeople and farmers. I therefore lost no time in reporting these circumstances to the Khan, and complained to him of the malconduct of his soldiers. In reply to this, he wrote an imperial edict, that I should exercise my authority as commander-in-chief, that I should put his son under any restraint I liked, that any of the Jete officers who were disobedient to me I should severely punish, and that every person guilty of injustice should be compelled to make retribution in proportion to his offense. Finding myself thus absolute ruler of all the country of Mavar al-Nahar, as well as of the nomade hordes and tribes, I forbade alias Khwaja or any of his officers from exercising authority over the natives. On this account, the sinews of their enmity were excited against me, and anger converted their hearts into blood. They therefore commenced practicing every kind of cruelty and injustice, and carried their tyranny to such a degree that they carried off 400 virgins from the city of Samarkand. They also made captives of 70 of the descendants of Muhammad belonging to Termuz, and converted them into slaves to wait on them. In consequence of these proceedings, the principal inhabitants of Mavar al-Nahar surrounded me, and said, "Is it to be borne by Mussulmans that these Jets should carry off 400 of their daughters from Samarkand and make slaves of them? But if this is not sufficiently disgraceful, how much worse is it to permit them to seize the descendants of the Prophet, on whom and on his descendants be grace? Young men who are firm in their belief that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, without any fault. Shall we who daily repeat his holy creed and hope to be received through his intercession into paradise, and shall we suffer these scoundrel Jets to take them away without making any exertion for their delivery?" On hearing these words, my Mussulman honor was roused, and I first sent a message to Beg Chuk, who commanded the Jeet troops, that he must immediately return all the Sayyids and the children of all the Mussulmans that had been taken away. As this message had no effect, I spoke to alias Khwaja on the subject, but as the Jets would not pay any attention to his orders, I put them to the proof by mounting my cavalry and liberating the 70 Sayyids. In consequence of this pious act, I dreamt that night that I saw the Prophet, who said to me, "In reward for this assistance that you have given to my descendants, the Almighty God will cause 70 of your descendants to occupy the throne of sovereignty." I wrote this circumstance to my peer, who sent me the following answer: that if the gracious God bestowed on the posterity of Subuktagean such a reward for his compassion to adhere, you who have assisted the descendants of the Prophet, how much greater will be your reward, even to the extent of 70 of your descendants. I was much rejoiced by this answer to my letter, and I daily added to my respect and esteem for the posterity of the Prophet, and I always illuminated my assemblies by the presence of these illustrious personages. For my peer said, "In whatever horde or town there are not any sides, and in whatever palace the learned have not free entrance, there exists neither blessings, goodness, piety, nor chastity." As I had exerted myself in repelling the injustice and cruelty of the Jeets, their chiefs bound round them the girdles of fraud and deceit, and they wrote to Tughlaq Timur Khan that Timur had raised the standard of rebellion and had taken possession of the whole province of Mavar al-Nahar, and intends to put your son alias Khwaja to death. When the letters of the chiefs, especially that of Beg Chuk, who considered himself the commander-in-chief of the Jete forces, reached the Khan, he believed their falsehoods to be truth. He issued an edict for my being put to death. This was the third edict he had issued for my murder. On receipt of this order, the Jeet chiefs consulted together and laid snares for my destruction. I was quite aware of their intentions, but pretended ignorance, for I could place no reliance on the inhabitants of Mavar al-Nahar to aid me against my foes. I therefore resolved to consult my peer, and wrote to him on the subject. He replied, in conformity with the holy tradition of Muhammad, "Flee when it's not safe to remain." I then consulted the Quran, and this verse opened, "The sun returns to its resting place. Such is the divine decree of the omniscient and omnipotent." I therefore left Samarkand and repaired to the mountain of Salan, where I remained 8 days. At the end of that time, I received a hint from the saint, Amir Kalal, that I should go towards the country of Khwarizm. Chapter 11. At this time a messenger came from Emir Husin, who was at that period a wanderer in the mountains and deserts, stating that as we were then both emigrants, it would be advisable to unite our efforts. I wrote him a letter appointing to meet him at the well of Sajai, or Sajuk. Thither I repaired, and in a few days was joined by him. We then entered into consultation respecting our affairs, and determined that we should go to Tukulbahadr of Kuk and prevail on him to join us. When we reached Kuk, that scoundrel pretended to forget our former acquaintance. According to the proverb, mankind imitate their rulers, and wished to seize us. When I discovered his views, I explained them to Emir Husin, who at first would not believe me, but I gave him such proofs that he was at length convinced, and we made preparations for going to Khwarizm, intending, when we should get possession of that country, to raise the standard of sovereignty and endeavor to conquer Mavar-al-Nahar. The plan we laid for invading Khwarizm was this. Finding that Tukel-Bahedar had behaved in so ungrateful and treacherous a manner, we left Kuk in the middle of the night and proceeded with all expedition towards Khwarizm. When we reached Banat, or Bayab, we rested our horses and resolved to attempt taking the fort of Arkonj by surprise, which would then lead to the subjection of all Khwarizm. Whilst we were deliberating on this matter, we observed a cloud of dust arise in the desert, and could soon discern an advance guard of cavalry coming towards us. We immediately mounted, and I sent Tugi-Berlas to reconnoitre. I then rode to the top of a hill in the desert and waited there. After a short time, Tugi-Berlas returned and informed me that the foe was Tukulbahadr, who had come in pursuit of us, having with him about 1,000 cavalry. I immediately sent for Emir Husin and drew up our forces on the hill in such a manner as to make them appear more numerous than they were. In fact, we had but 60 well-mounted troopers with us. These I formed into 5 sections. The first of these I placed under the command of Tugi-Berlas, the second I gave under charge of Sif ad-Din, the third to Bulki-Bahadr, the fourth consisted of Emir Husin and his followers, and the fifth were my own dependents, with whom I took possession of the top of the hill. When I had made this arrangement, I gave each of them a flag to distinguish them. At this time, Tukel-Bahedar, having drawn out his 1,000 cavalry, charged us, but was vigorously opposed by Tugi-Berlas and Sif ad-Din, so that his leading divisions fell back in astonishment. These 2 officers pursued their advantage, and fought with such intrepidity that both their horses were disabled. They, however, continued to fight on foot till I sent them 2 of my own horses, on which they mounted. The horse of Bulki-Bahadr was also knocked down, so that I was obliged to remount him from my own stud. At this period, of the whole number of the enemy, only 300 remained. The others had been either killed, wounded, or fled. In the meantime, Emir Husin had also drawn the sword of courage, and having charged the centre of the enemy's line, approached close to Tukulbahadr, but the soldiers of the latter surrounded him. Seeing my brother-in-law in this situation, I rushed forward, sword in hand, and liberated him. When the hour of evening prayer arrived, the chiefs of the enemy drew in their reins. At this time, they had only 150 men remaining, while my strength was reduced to 12. After a short time, Tukel-Bahedar again drew up his men and charged us. Emir Husin and our remaining companions devoted ourselves to death, and when they attempted to seize us, I exerted myself in such a manner as to overthrow several of their champions. At this moment, the horse of Emir Husin, being wounded by an arrow, threw him. His wife, Dilshad Aga, however, immediately dismounted and gave him her horse. I remounted Dilshad Aga upon the same horse with my wife, the sister of Emir Husin. We then commenced shooting our arrows, not one of which missed its mark, till our quivers were emptied. There now remained of us but 7 mounted persons, but the enemy being also very much reduced, they withdrew from the fight and alighted in the plain. Our small party took the opportunity of proceeding on our journey. We were soon followed by our adversaries, but they missed us and lost their way in the desert. After we had travelled a long way in these extensive plains, we came to a well, and being very hungry and thirsty, we alighted. Fortunately for us, the water of the well was delicious. We remained at the well all night, And in the morning I reckoned our people, and found that they were 7 mounted persons and 3 foot soldiers of bulk. We continued by the well all that day, and fortunately for us, a shepherd who was tending his flock in the desert brought them to drink at the well. As our provisions were exhausted, we bought several goats. Parts of them we roasted, and parts of them we dressed between stones, and enjoyed ourselves exceedingly. We remained there another night, during which time the 3 footmen of bulk ungratefully stole 3 of our horses and rode off with them. We were thus reduced to 7 persons, with only 4 horses. But I did not then despond, and even comforted my companions. My respected wife, Alcay Turkan Aga, also kept up her spirits, and said, "Surely our fortunes are now arrived at the lowest point, and must rise, that we should be obliged to walk." What added to our distress was that none of us knew the road. Fortunately, we discovered a shepherd who pointed out a pathway to us and said, "This path will lead you to the huts of some Turkomans." I was delighted with this intelligence, and I set out on foot. When we arrived in the vicinity of the huts, we found that the inhabitants had apparently left them and gone away. We therefore entered and took possession of one of them, but some of the Turkomans who had remained behind, when they saw us, thought we were thieves and made an attack on us. I placed my wife, the sister of Emir Hussein, in one of the huts, and with 3 or 4 of my men, we made an appearance of repelling them with bows and arrows, but we were without arrows, having expended them in the battle. We then drew our swords, but when they came close to us, one of them, named Syed Mohammed, who was an old acquaintance, recollected me, came and embraced me, and had compassion on my situation. And when informed of all the circumstances, he forbade the Turkomans to injure us, and said to them, "This is Timur, the governor of Mavaralnaha." The men, being also ashamed of their conduct, came and bent the knee to me. Syed Mohammed took me to his own habitation, and paid me much respect and honor, and showed us all the attention in his power. At this time I had on 2 ruby armlets. One of these I gave to him, in return for which he procured 3 horses for me, also some travelling equipage, armor, and arms. For 3 days he entertained us most hospitably, and gave us an escort of 10 troopers, commanded by Fulanshi and Ajachi. Of the horses which he provided for me, I gave 2 to Emir Hussein, and being thus well equipped, I determined within myself that I should go and remain in the Mahmudi desert till my followers, gaining intelligence of the circumstance, might come and join me. I therefore made Fulanshi our guide, and we wandered in the desert for 2 days and 2 nights, without water or bread, till at length we reached the village of Mahmudi, but which we found in a ruinous and deserted state, and void of inhabitants. We, however, alighted among the ruins, and as we could not find water, we were obliged to dig a well, and remained there for a month. Chapter 12. At the end of this time, Ali Beg Gurbani, chief of the Turkomans, having been informed that Timur was in the desert, and was endeavoring to collect his followers for the purpose of plundering the Turkomans, was alarmed, and sent a party to seize me by surprise. In fact, whilst we were quite off our guard, they made a night attack on us, seized me, and led me to the Turkoman cantonment. When arrived there, Ali Beg, without seeing me, ordered me to be confined in a cowhouse, swarming with fleas and other vermin, where he kept me and my wife without any other companion than the vermin, for 53 days and nights. At this time I made a vow to God that I would never keep any person, whether guilty or innocent, for any length of time, in prison or in chains. At length, encouraged by the predictions of my rising to sovereignty, I resolved either to make my escape from the horrid place or terminate my existence. I therefore determined to make the attempt, and either to be victorious or to die manfully. At first I endeavored to win over my keepers by promises of reward, but being unsuccessful, I seized the sword of one of the sentinels and attacked the guard. They fled, and I pursued them even into the presence of their chieftain. When Ali Beg saw my determined bravery and exertion, he was struck with remorse, and repented of his conduct, and sent back all the things that he had plundered from me. At this time a letter was delivered to him from his brother Mohammed Beg Gurbani, the contents of which were, "It is reported in Khurasan that you have seized and imprisoned Emir Timur. Such conduct is highly unbecoming and improper. It is requisite that you should immediately apologize to him, that you treat him with the greatest honor and respect, and that you deliver to his highness the curiosities and presents which I have sent. In consequence of this letter, Ali Beg waited on me in a hut, which had been assigned for the purpose, asked my pardon, and gave me some of the presents which his brother had sent. But as he was a mean and avaricious wretch, he purloined many of them. Having thus escaped from the clutches of Ali Beg, I was enabled to collect 12 horsemen. However, with these I again raised the standard of royalty and resolved to proceed to the desert of Khwarizm. After 2 days we reached a village, where I alighted and took possession of a house, but I had no sooner done so than a party of Turkomans came out of the other houses, and prepared to attack me. I closed the door upon my wife, the sister of Amir Hussin, and attacked them. At this time one of them, named Ahmed, recollected me, called out to them to desist, and with his followers, whom he had brought for the purpose of joining me, came and bent their knees, made their salutations, and entered my service. I placed my own turban on his head. In consequence of this honor, he promised to bring me 50 cavalry. About this time, Mubarak Shah Sunjari joined me with 100 cavalry. He also brought me several horses as a present. In short, a number of the Sayeds and other people of Khorasan joined me and brought numerous presents. When I had collected about 1,000 horse and foot in the desert, Amir Husin, having taken some offense, left me and set off for Gurmsir and Kandahar. At this time, Mubarak Shah and some other chiefs waited upon me and said, "Our remaining here in the desert will be quite ruinous to our affairs. It is probable that Alias Khwaja may send a Jete army against us. It is therefore better that we should quit this desert. Let us go either to Khwarizm or the countries of Merve Shah Jahan or Badguish and subdue one of them." I approved of their advice, but I reflected that it was predicted in my horoscope that I should mount the throne of Mavaralnaha, the country of my Gurgan ancestors, and I showed the horoscope to Mubarak Shah and the other officers, all of whom were pleased with it. At length we determined that we would take the 200 soldiers and canton them in the vicinity of Kesh, where they might remain till wanted, while I should go among the nomade hordes and clans and endeavor to collect more partisans. Having repeated the prayer for success, we set out, and having reached the village of Karindan, a dependency of Bukhara, I first fixed on cantonments for my officers and soldiers, and I left my wife, Olje Turkan Aga, there. Being thus alone, I went and passed my time amongst the hordes and tribes. At this time, Timurkuji, who was one of my friends, having heard of my arrival, joined me with 40 troopers and paid me great attention. I therefore let him into my secret and sent him to remain with my other troops, with orders that as soon as he should hear of my having raised the standard of independence in Samarkand, he should immediately join me. When a number of persons from the hordes, the clans, and the tribes had agreed to join me, I determined that I would take with me 1,000 of my bravest followers and conceal ourselves in the city of Samarkand, and that another 1,000 should follow me and take up their abode in the neighborhood. In consequence of this arrangement, I marched in the middle of the night and proceeded towards the city. The next night I entered Samarkand about the time of the last prayer, and took up my abode at the house of my eldest sister, Kutluk Turkan Aga. I passed 48 days in the city of Samarkand, but when matters were nearly ready for my breaking out on the troops of Jetta and destroying them, some of the inhabitants discovered my plot and loosed their tongues in divulging my secret. My intentions being thus made known, I was under the necessity of quitting Samarkand. I, therefore, left it in the middle of the night and repaired to the vicinity of Kesh. But as I found it imprudent to remain there, I proceeded with 50 followers towards Khwarizm. But as several of my people were without horses and found it extremely uncomfortable to travel on foot, by good luck we discovered a herd of horses which were at pasture in the plains of Ajfa. I sent to inquire to whom they belonged, and having ascertained that they were the property of a tribe of Turkomans, I wrote a royal edict to the proprietors and seized the herd. Having divided the horses among my foot soldiers, and now being well mounted, we galloped onto the banks of the Jihun and encamped on the side of the river. After a week, we crossed the river, and having reached the village of Akhfi, where the country was composed of hill and dale, and the weather being very warm, we remained under the shade of some trees on the bank of the river Amovi for a month, and passed our time in hunting and shooting. At this place, my wife and Mubarak Shah, with the other officers I had left at Karindan, joined me with their troops. When my party was augmented to 1,000 men, being distressed for provisions, I consulted the officers what we should do. They advised me that we should go and seize upon the country of Badguish, and having taken possession of it, we might then plunder the territory of Merve Shah Jahan, by which means our followers would be relieved from their distress and want. I said to them, "This is all very well, but it appears to me better that we should go to Bakhtar and Kandahar, and if we can take the latter place, we shall then become rulers of Kabulistan, of Sindh, and Multan." They all approved of this advice and agreed to follow it. We then repeated the prayer for success and prepared to march. Previous to attempting so bold a measure, I thought it requisite to inspect my forces and to equip them in the best manner possible. I found that I had just 1,000 soldiers of my own, both foot and horse, but as many of them were in a wretched plight, I disposed of various ornaments which I had in store, and divided the amount among them. I then set out at the head of my cavalry. When we reached the banks of the river Herman, I entrenched my camp, and gave orders that every person in the army should construct a house or hut for himself. I also determined that I would take possession of Gurmsir and Kandahar, and raise the standard of royalty. On this principle I sent a summons to Mir Mehedi, the Kalantar of Gurmsir, and followed it in person. When Mir Mehedi received the summons and was informed of my approach by the sound of my trumpets, he advanced to meet me with the steps of submission. On his arrival in my presence, I placed my turban on his head, and he brought me many presents. Thus I became ruler, Hakim, of Gurmsir, and subdued it. At this time, Amir Husin, who had chosen to abandon me, came and rejoined me, and I gave over to him half of the revenue of Gurmsir. After we had remained for some time in that situation, the ruler, Vali, of Sistan, sent an ambassador to me, and laid the foundations of friendship. He also sent me valuable presents worthy of his rank. I made choice of the territory of Gurmsir for my own residence, and waited a favorable opportunity to take Kandahar out of the hands of the Ghori dynasty and to erect my own standard. Chapter 13. A.D. 1362. When in the year A.H. 764 I had attained my 28th year, the valley of Sistan, having entered into a war with some of his enemies, was defeated, lost several of his fortresses, and all his depots were plundered. He therefore wrote to beg my assistance, and requesting that I would deliver him from the hands of his oppressors, as he was without any other means of redress. I soon after received a second letter from him, stating his utter helplessness, but that if I would protect him, he would furnish provisions for my 1,000 cavalry. I consulted with Amir Husin on this subject. He was desirous of going alone, hoping that he might thereby get possession of the fortresses for himself. I, however, consented, and appointed Behram Jalaya to the command of his advance, but Husin had only made one march towards Sistan, when Jalaya, having no confidence in him, deserted and went towards Hindustan. Husin, considering this as a bad omen, sent a messenger to inform me of the circumstance, and to request that I would join him with my troops, so that we might conjointly subdue the fortresses of Sistan. When we had turned our reins towards Sistan, the valley ruler of that province, named Jalal ad-Din Mahmud, performed the ceremony of meeting us, and presented me a number of rarities. On this account Amir Husin was jealous. I therefore sent all the presents to him. The valley also, according to his agreement, furnished the provisions for 1,000 cavalry, and made a solemn promise of fealty and attachment. As these promises seemed to be sincere, I resolved to assist him, and having made a suitable disposition of my troops, we commenced our march in regular order. The mode that I determined on for subduing the fortresses of Sistan was this. The number of the forts which the enemies of the valley had forcibly taken possession of were 7. The first of these that we attacked, we took in one night and one day. Our troops escaladed the walls and the bastions, and rushed into the citadel. We found a quantity of provisions in the fort, all of which Emir Hassin took possession of and appointed his own governor. The second fort we attacked, the garrison came out and fought with us. As that country produced a quantity of underwood, I ordered our people to make fascines, with which they advanced close to the walls, but the enemy, seeing this, called for quarter and delivered up the fort. Hassin again was beforehand with me and immediately appointed his own governor and divided the plunder among his own people and did not even give me thanks for my exertions. When we went against the third fort, we arrived there in the middle of the night. As the fortress was situated in a sandy plain, I ordered the troops to dismount and prepare their bows and arrows. We then advanced in silence close to the walls and discovered that all the sentinels, except one, were asleep. My people threw their rope ladders on the battlements and quickly mounted, and having subdued the garrison, brought them bound to me and retained possession of the fort. All this took place before Emir Hassan arrived with his army. When the Sistan rebels saw our rapid success, they were much alarmed and made overtures to their ruler, saying, "We have no objection to give up the remaining places to you, but if Timur is permitted to take them, he will not only retain possession of them, but of the whole country." The valley, being thus alarmed by this intelligence, marched off without giving me any notice, and having been joined by all his other troops, advanced against us. I drew out our army in 3 divisions. Hassin took the command of the division opposed to the enemy's right. The 2nd division, under charge of one of the officers, was opposed to their left, and the 3rd division, consisting of my own troops, formed the first line, Herreval. I placed the archers in front, and the cavalry with swords drawn in their rear. The archers poured in their arrows, and the cavalry, having made a furious charge, threw the enemy into confusion. I then, accompanied by 12 troopers, dashed in among them. At this time I was wounded by 2 arrows, one in the arm, the other in the foot. I was so much engaged that I did not feel them at the time, but continued to fight till the enemy fled. Having gained the victory, we turned our reins towards Gurmsir. During the march, I said to Emir Hassin, "All this misfortune has been caused by your covetousness," upon which he was much ashamed. I now thought it advisable to proceed to Gurmsir and remain there till my wounds should be cured. In the meantime, Emir Hassin might invade Baekelan and subdue it. I therefore selected 200 horse and sent them with him, but counselled him to endeavour to make friends of the people of Baekelan, and if the army of the Geats should oppose him, to avoid fighting them. When Hassan entered Baekelan, he conducted himself improperly and gave no encouragement to the soldiers of that country, who offered to join him. He even disgusted his old servants by his avarice. He also felt so little fear of his enemies that he began to collect wealth and to accumulate riches. At this time, a Juni Beg, the brother of Beg Chuk, having placed an army of the Geats in ambuscade, made an unexpected attack on Hassin and defeated him, so that he was obliged to flee with only 4 horsemen and 12 footmen to the village of Sherku. I was much vexed and hurt by this misfortune, and wished to go and drive the Geats out of Mavaralnaha, but I was obliged to remain quiet till I had recovered of my wounds. I then commenced arrangements for recovering that province. But at this period my army was so much reduced that I had only 40 troopers remaining with me. The first measure I proposed was to take up my abode either in the valley of Arsuf or the valley of Kuz, which were situated in the vicinity of Balkh, and having there collected an army, then to make an attack on the troops of Jetta. In consequence of this determination, accompanied by Timur Khwaja Aglan, who was the commander of my troops, I marched from Gurmsir. On this occasion, Mir Mehedi, the Kalantar of that district, behaved to me with great attention, by preparing huts for the residence of those I was obliged to leave behind, and by supplying provisions for us all. Being now satisfied in my mind, I set off with great celerity. On examining my 40 troopers, I found they were all people of good family, and not an ignoble person amongst them. I, therefore, returned thanks to God that in my distress so many persons of illustrious birth still remained attached to my fortunes, and was convinced in my own mind that Providence intended me for some glorious actions by having bestowed on me so many noble and disinterested friends. At this time, Sadik Berlas, who was a descendant of Kerachanuyan, came out with a party to join me. When they were seen at a distance, my people supposed they were enemies that were come in pursuit of us. I therefore sent Subek Bahadur to reconnoitre. He soon returned and informed me that it was Sadik Berlas, who, with 100 warriors, was come to join me. I therefore advanced towards him, as he had been one of my intimate companions. As soon as he saw me, he was much affected. I was also much affected, as were all the persons present, and I prayed devoutly to God that he would grant me power to deliver Mavaralnahar from the oppressions of the Geats. We then left our encampment and proceeded towards the valley of Arsuf. During our march, a messenger arrived from Emir Husin, requesting me to send some troops to escort him and that he would rejoin me. I immediately sent off Sadik Berlas with 40 troopers to protect him and requested that he would meet me at the valley of Arsuf. I then proceeded on my journey, and soon after saw a large party of troops who had taken post on the top of a hill, and their numbers appeared to be constantly increasing. I therefore drew in my reins and arranged my people in order of battle, resolving, if they were enemies, to attack them. At the same time, I sent off the leader of my advance guard with a party to ascertain who they were. As he was a courageous fellow, he galloped up to the hill and called out to them, "Whose troops are you?" They replied, "We are the servants of Emir Timur and are in search of him." On this, my officer went and visited the chief and shortly brought me word that it was Kerenchi Bahadur, one of my old servants, who with 100 troopers had deserted from the Geat army 18 days ago and was come to join me. I prostrated myself in gratitude to God for this favor and gave orders for the chief being admitted. When he approached, I considered his coming as an auspicious omen. I therefore embraced him and placed my own turban on his head. We then proceeded towards the valley of Arsuf. During the march, 2 lions made their appearance, one of them a male, the other a female. I resolved to kill them myself, and having shot them both with arrows, I considered this circumstance as a lucky omen. That night we encamped in a wood abounding with grass and water, and having marched the next day, we arrived at some broken ground in the valley, adjoining to which was a hill. I took up my quarters on the hill, from whence I could see a great distance all around, and as there was a rivulet running round the bottom of the hill, I ordered the troops to encamp on its bank. In this situation we remained for 3 days, constantly expecting the arrival of Emir Husin. During this period, my warriors lived upon the game which we killed. At length I sent a party towards Balkh, with orders to search for a flock of sheep and to bring them with their owners to me. After 2 days, my people, having found several flocks of goats and sheep, brought them with their owners to my encampment. The poor fellows were dreadfully frightened, but I paid them for the animals, with some durists, a small gold coin, that I had by me, and divided the males among the soldiers, but ordered the females to be kept for their milk and butter, of which I gave a daily portion to each person. When this trait of my justice was made known to the farmers of Balkh, they brought to my encampment grain and all kinds of provisions, by which my troops were much refreshed. Whilst we were waiting here in expectation of Emir Husin, my people enjoyed themselves under the shelter of the hill and the bank of the rivulet, whilst I, with my confidential friends, had a tent pitched on the top of the hill. On the 14th night, when the moon shone bright, I could not sleep. I therefore walked about, and when I returned to the hill, the day was beginning to break. I therefore prostrated myself in prayer, and as I was much affected, I supplicated the Almighty to deliver me from these toils and render me successful and victorious. I then employed myself in prayers to the Prophet and his descendants. After this, I fell asleep and dreamt that I heard some person say, "Be patient, for victory is at hand." I was so much rejoiced by this that I awoke. Just at this time, I saw from the hill at the distance of an arrow's flight a number of soldiers who appeared to be coming from Balkh and going towards Kumrud. I immediately mounted my horse, and having approached them, I asked, "Whence come ye, and whither are ye going?" They replied, "We are the servants of Emir Timur, and have come out in search of him, but cannot find him, although we have heard that he has left Kumrud and is come to the valley of Arsuf." I said, "I am one of the Emir's servants. If you wish, I will guide you to him." When they had heard my words, one of them galloped up to the officers and said to them, "We have found a guide who will lead us to the emir." They then drew in their reins and gave orders for my being brought to them. They consisted of 3 troops. The first of the officers was Tughlaq Khwaja Burlas, the second Sif ad-Din, and the third Tubuk Bahadur. When they saw me, they were overwhelmed with joy. They alighted from their horses, bent their knees, and kissed my stirrup. I also came down from my horse and took each of them in my arms, and I put my turban on the head of Tughlaq Khwaji, and my girdle, which was richly embroidered, I bound round the loins of Emir Sif ad-Din, and I clothed Tubuk Bahadur in my coat, and they wept, and I also wept, and the hour of prayer was arrived, and we prayed with tranquil minds. We then mounted and came to my encampment, where we remained for some time. I assembled my principal people and gave a feast, and having killed a quantity of game, we had abundance of meat, for which we returned thanks to God. Having made the valley of Arsuf my headquarters, I sent out detachments on all sides to gain intelligence and enjoyed myself in the society of my friends. One day my spies brought information that a party of troops were advancing rapidly from Kumrud. I immediately ordered my people to draw up in order of battle and took post myself on the top of the hill, from whence I could clearly see a large party advancing rapidly. I said to myself, "God help us," and having formed my troops into 3 divisions, I advanced at the head of one of them. Presently I saw a horseman coming towards me at full speed. When he drew near, he alighted, and having bent his knee, said that the troops were those of Shire Bayram, one of my old servants, who, having left the army with an intention of going to Hindustan, had repented, was on his return to me, begged pardon for his offence, and requested permission to pay his respects. I accepted the apology and advanced to meet him. When he came near, he hung down his head through shame, but I embraced him and placed my own cap on his head and bound my quiver about his loins. Having reached my habitation, we alighted, and I made a great entertainment. 4 days afterwards, intelligence was brought that Sadiq Burlas, whom I had sent to escort Emir Husin, was approaching the camp. I therefore mounted my horse and went out to meet the prince. Having embraced, I led him to my tent, and we conversed on all the events that had occurred since our separation. After which, I gave him an entertainment. We remained for some time in the valley of Arsuf, and I sent spies to bring me intelligence of the Jit army. At length the spies returned with information that Qumar ad-Din and Emir Hamid had arrived with a large force to annihilate me. I therefore assembled my forces and made arrangements for opposing them. But the Jaits, having heard that my sword was not returning to its scabbard without a victim, nor my arrow to its quiver without success, lost their courage, separated from each other, and fled in different directions, leaving the country free to me. Chapter 14. Being now thoroughly convinced of the rancour and malice of my enemies, I resolved to be more strict and attentive to my own conduct than I had been before, and to preserve a greater appearance of dignity and authority, so as to overawe the disaffected and enforce obedience from the rebellious. I therefore wrote letters of summons to the princes of Badakhshan, to Kaiser Usuri, and to all the tribes that inhabited the left bank of the Jihun, or Oxus, stating that I was now resolved to enforce obedience to my commands, and strongly intimating to them that it would be more prudent for them to come voluntarily than to wait for my enforcing their attendance. When the letters of summons reached these princes and chiefs, the greater number of them, especially the princes of Badakhshan, came of their own accord and bound the girdle of fidelity. I then summoned all the learned men and Sayyids of Mavaralnahar to hold a public assembly, and I consulted them on the best mode of supporting and maintaining the Christian and Jewish inhabitants so as to prevent any discontent. When they had considered the subject with attention, they decided that the worshippers of idols might be permitted to reside in my dominions, on payment of half the usual taxes, but that they should not be allowed to wear arms. I accordingly appointed separate officers to collect from them the half taxes which was henceforth levied on them, while they were prohibited the privilege of bearing arms. At this time I had reached my 30th year, and had been for 5 years engaged in a constant succession of wars, by which a number of my faithful soldiers had been killed or disabled, and several of my best officers were beginning to murmur. I therefore endeavored to soothe them and cause them to be re-equipped with money from my treasury. I placed my foot in the stirrup and proceeded to the city of Subs, Kesh, where I ordered the building of the citadel to be completed, and I then applied myself to improving and beautifying the new city. I also published a general amnesty in order that no one might have any pretense for absenting himself from me, by which I gained the goodwill of my soldiers and the blessings of the inhabitants, who now recovered from their fears of exaction and punishment. It was in consequence of this measure that the learned men of Mavar-al-Nahar became firmly attached to my interest. The Sayyids declared me the favorite of the Prophet, and the officers and soldiers devoted themselves zealously to my service. I therefore summoned another council, in which it was determined that the best measure for securing peace and tranquillity in Mavar-al-Nahar would be to prevail on the Khan of the Jets to confirm my appointment, for which purpose I wrote him a letter, couched in the most respectful language, and sent it by one of my most trusty officers, with numerous valuable presents, hoping by this means to remove any suspicion which he might have of my intentions. As soon as my ambassador arrived at the Yet court and delivered my letter and presents, the Khan received them graciously, but said, "I am well aware that the birth of Timur is a miraculous event, destined for the accomplishment of great things. I also know that if I should again attempt his ruin, I should fail in the object, but I wish to see him. Go and bring him to me." My messenger wrote me all that had passed, on receipt of which I assembled a council of my principal officers to deliberate whether I should comply with the invitation or not. Some of them were of opinion that it was prudent to go, while others dissuaded me, saying it was dangerous. I at length decided for myself that I would trust to my own skill and address. Having taken my resolution, I left Samarkand with a select retinue of the bravest men I could muster, but took the precaution of sending my baggage and the main body of my troops into Khorasan, in readiness for any turn of fortune. I soon passed the Jihun and advanced into the desert, but before I reached the camp of the Jet Prince, some of his officers met me, who treated me with much respect, and declared that they had received the strictest orders from the Khan to bring me into his presence with all possible honor. I therefore proceeded without hesitation, and was presented at his court, where I delivered a suitable speech, and he gave me a gracious reception, and seated me very near his throne, praising me exceedingly for the abilities I had displayed in the management of Mavar-al-Nahar. He afterwards consulted me on several points of government, and I gave him such answers as appeared to increase his good opinion of me. I remained at the court of the Khan for some time, during which I frequently gave him the benefit of my advice, and so ingratiated myself with him that he not only confirmed my authority in Mavar-al-Nahar, but entrusted me with the entire direction of his armies in that country. He even gave me one of his own standards, and promised me the most liberal support and assistance in all my undertakings. Having attained this object, and perceiving that the intrigues of some of the Jet courtiers were beginning to operate against me, I asked permission of the Khan to return to my government. He acquiesced, and in my presence gave strict injunctions to all his principal officers that they should yield implicit obedience to my commands and cooperate with me in every measure. On this, I took my leave of the Khan, and crossing the desert, arrived in the vicinity of Samarkand, where I was received with the greatest demonstrations of joy. Thus, in the course of a few months, by my earnest endeavors and the blessing of the Almighty, I accomplished a matter of great political importance, without bloodshed, which contributed essentially to the tranquillity of my government. Chapter 15. When I reached my 31st year, I had reigned 5 years, during which time I had experienced many vicissitudes of fortune. At this period, a new trouble arose from the envy and malice of my near connection and brother-in-law, the Emir Husin, who was mortified at my success and jealous of my popularity with the troops. He endeavored by various intrigues to lessen my reputation and to gain the affections of the people. In short, he left no means untried to sow dissension between me and my officers, but for a time I was able to counteract his designs and to preserve the external appearance of friendship. It happened about this time that the Yet army again invaded Mavaralnaha, which induced the inhabitants with one voice to call upon me for protection. I therefore drew out my forces and marched against the enemy. On this occasion, I wrote to the Emir Husin, inviting him to join me and unite our efforts for the defense of our country. But he, actuated by his usual jealousy, contrived endless delays and sent me only evasive answers. Meanwhile, I boldly attacked the Geats, and after a hard-fought battle, drove them out of Mavaralnaha and returned in triumph to Samarkand. The inhabitants, on this event, greeted me with acclamations and hailed me as their deliverer. Jealousy is an incurable disease, and the success which had attended my arms only inflamed the envy of Husin. He openly blamed me for driving the Geats so soon out of Mavaralnaha, saying that I ought to have made peace with them, and thereby have prevented them from returning. But as nobody believed his misrepresentations, he found that no reliance was to be placed on mere calumny, and he therefore resolved to attack me by force of arms. Being informed of his design, I made preparations for my defense and endeavored to secure the tranquility of my dominions on every side. After considerable negotiation and some partial hostilities, I found myself compelled to march against Husin, who had collected an army and was about to invade my territory. I accordingly assembled my officers, explained to them the perfidious conduct of Husin, and was gratified to see the spirit with which they all declared their readiness to support me. Having taken the field, we had several skirmishes, in one of which I made the prince himself prisoner. But remembering our former friendship, I treated him with forbearance, and once more restored him to liberty. My clemency, however, had no effect on his obdurate heart, and he continued his attempts against me with increased rancor. At length, the principals of the hordes and tribes he had oppressed threw off their allegiance to him and joined me. In vain did I again offer him pardon and propose a reconciliation. In vain did my father-in-law and others intercede with him. His only reply was that he would be satisfied with nothing less than my ruin. Chapter 16. A.D. 1364. Notwithstanding the obstinate enmity of Husin, I resolved to guard, as far as possible, against the evils of a civil war, and to confine our operations to those provinces which were devoted to him or to me, that so the peaceable inhabitants might not suffer from our contention. But this moderation was impracticable. The restless spirit of Husin urged him to acts of aggression, which compelled me to chastise him, and at length, in a decisive battle, I defeated him so completely that he abandoned his camp and fled with only a few attendants to the mountains. This victory rendered me absolute master of the open country. I then marched into the heart of his territories and besieged him in his capital. The siege was short, for his army, dispirited by defeat, was not disposed to make a vigorous resistance. In a few days, he was compelled to surrender at discretion. The chiefs of the tribes and princes whom he had cruelly oppressed demanded that he should be put to death. My own heart suggested more generous feelings, but as he had thrice sworn on the Koran to remain faithful and had thrice forsworn himself, I could not, without injustice to my people, again restore him to liberty. Leaving him, therefore, under a secure guard, I summoned the Sayyids and learned men, before whom his enemies accused him of the murder of their relatives or followers. The Qazis and lawyers declared that by the laws of retaliation his life was forfeited, and the majority of those present, excepting myself, agreed in the sentence. I was unwilling to shed his blood, but the kinsmen of those whom he had slain enforced their claims, and he was put to death. Thus, by the permission of the Almighty, ended the career of a prince who, notwithstanding his near alliance to me, had never ceased to plot my destruction. The chiefs of the tribes and the inhabitants of the country, which had been oppressed by him, offered their thanks to heaven, and I used all my endeavors to heal the wounds which his misrule had inflicted. Chapter 17. A.D. 1365. In the year of the Hijra 767, corresponding to A.D. 1365, I began to enjoy some repose after the multitude of troubles and dangers through which I had passed. Seated on the throne of Mavaralnaha in the city of Samarkand, which I made my capital, I now meditated the conquest of Khorasan and the surrounding countries. But before I engaged in distant enterprises, it was necessary to assure myself of the tranquillity of my own dominions and to extinguish or conciliate the remnants of faction which still lurked in a few of the districts. This design I accomplished by distributing among the heads of tribes and the governors of towns so many marks of my bounty as confirmed the attachment of my friends and softened the resentment of those who had opposed me. In particular, I granted a full amnesty for all past offences, caused large sums of money to be issued from my treasury for the relief of the poor and for the encouragement of agriculture, and promoted the best officers of my army to situations of honour and emolument. To the learned men and prelates I showed every mark of deference, conferring valuable privileges on the Sayyids, who are the descendants of the Prophet, and securing the property of the dervishes and religious mendicants from all taxation. The effect of these measures was soon visible in the prosperity of the people and the restoration of confidence and order throughout Mavaralnaher. About this time I had the happiness to marry a princess connected with some of the principal chiefs of the Geats. This alliance increased my power and strengthened the bonds of peace between me and the neighboring tribes. Yet, notwithstanding these friendly relations, I received intelligence that the Geats were actually preparing to invade my dominions, incited, as I discovered, by a few disaffected chieftains who still retained envy and malice at my fortune. To prevent the evil, I remonstrated with the Khan of the Yets, but his authority over his turbulent subjects was far from absolute, and they, without his knowledge or consent, entered Mavaralnaha in great force. On their approach, I placed myself at the head of my army, and soon drove them back with considerable loss. Thus, by the blessing of Providence, all attempts against my government proved unsuccessful, and the reputation of my arms continued to increase. Chapter 18. The next event of importance was the arrival of an ambassador from the Prince of Herat, requesting my aid against some of his enemies in Khorasan. As he was a friend whom I had formally established on the throne of Herat, I consented to assist him, and commenced preparations for crossing the Oxus. But intelligence reached me that in Herat itself much discontent prevailed against the prince, and as I had no desire to waste my strength in supporting a government which did not rest on the affections of its people, I sent able envoys to examine into the state of the country. Their report was unfavorable, and I resolved to delay any expedition into Khorasan until I should be thoroughly informed of the disposition of the inhabitants. This caution gave me time to receive the compliments and congratulations of distant princes, some of whom proposed intermarriages between our families as a pledge of mutual friendship. I also took occasion to renew alliances with those who bordered on my dominions, in order that I might leave Mavaralnaha without fear of disturbance whenever the time should arrive for my more distant enterprises. During this interval, I occupied myself in improving the internal administration of my empire, regulating the revenues, appointing just and upright officers over the districts, encouraging trade, and inviting learned men from all parts of Asia to settle at Samarkand. Under these wise ordinances, the face of affairs quickly changed, and the country, which had so long been a scene of civil commotion, began to enjoy the blessings of peace and prosperity. Chapter 19. In the course of my regulations for the internal welfare of Mavaralnaha, one of the principal objects which engaged my attention was the purification of justice and the suppression of every species of extortion. I had often observed that crimes remained unpunished through the venality of those who acted as magistrates or under the influence of powerful chieftains. I therefore selected an individual of tried integrity and conferred on him the supreme administration of the laws, vesting in him the fullest authority for the punishment of offenders and the redress of public grievances. This measure was supported by the chief of the Sayyids and the principal prelates, who represented to me that according to the Prophet's words, a single day's justice of a prince is more precious than the devotions of 1,000 worshippers. They also reminded me of the injunctions of the Quran, that he who spares the guilty robs the innocent. Under these impressions, I caused an exact register to be kept of every judicial proceeding, and the officer whom I appointed was expressly charged to report to me weekly all that had been done in the execution of the laws. By this vigilance, I discovered several acts of oppression which had escaped former inquiries, and some of the agents of government were condemned to severe punishment. The effect of these examples was that in a short time the confidence of the people was restored, and complaint was seldom heard within the limits of my dominions. Chapter 20. Having thus established internal order, I was at liberty to turn my eyes abroad and to extend my conquests. The first country to which I directed my attention was the extensive region of Khuwarizm, on the lower Oxus, which was then governed by a chief named Husin Sufi, who treated the people with severity and appeared likely to become an unquiet neighbor. I received, indeed, many complaints from the principal inhabitants of that country, who entreated me to deliver them from his tyranny and to incorporate their province with my kingdom of Mavar-al-Nahar. I therefore marched an army towards Khwarizm. Husin Sufi opposed my troops with a considerable force, but was defeated in several engagements, and being at length alarmed for his personal safety, he wrote me a letter, couched in the most submissive language, accompanied by valuable presents, and offered a family alliance by giving a princess of his house in marriage to one of my sons, that so I might entrust him with the government under my authority. Wishing to avoid the effusion of blood, I accepted his offers, on condition of leaving my officers in charge of the public revenues of Khuwarizm. To this he gave a ready assent, and the marriage was accordingly celebrated with great pomp and festivity. I then returned in tranquillity to Samarkand. Chapter 21. On my arrival at Samarkand, I was met by disastrous intelligence from Badakhshan and other quarters, but these tumults were suppressed by my governors. The principal vexation which now disturbed my peace arose from the restless spirit of some chiefs who had previously served under my late enemy, Husin. They were discontented at not having received sufficient rewards, as they deemed, for joining my cause. Or rather, they could not relish the tranquillity of established government, and were always seeking new adventures. The worst of these was one named Kai Kuseru, who had been high in Husin's confidence, and who still displayed that inordinate ambition which had brought so many mischiefs upon the country. I offered him honorable employment, but he secretly conspired with the Sufi princes of Khwarizm to subvert my power, and I discovered that his letters to them contained proposals for a simultaneous rising against me. As soon as I had proof of his guilt, I summoned him to my presence, and in a large assembly of my nobles and councillors produced the intercepted letters and confronted him with the messengers who bore them. He could not deny the charge, but entreated my mercy. My chiefs, exasperated at his treachery, urged me to punish him with death. But reflecting on our former intercourse, I contented myself with depriving him of the government he held and putting him under restraint for a time. As soon as I judged it safe, I permitted him to retire to private life. By removing this dangerous man, I removed the chief source of disquiet in Mavar-al-Nahar, and as the countries of Khwarizm, Balkh, and Kutalan were now firmly attached to my dominion, I found myself not only secure, but powerful enough to undertake new conquests or to repel any invasion from without. Chapter 22. The cessation of internal troubles had scarce been effected when intelligence reached me that the Jait commander, Qamar ad-Din, who on several occasions had led armies against me, had again collected forces and was ravaging the frontiers of Mavar-al-Nahar. My indignation was roused at this renewed attempt, and I marched from Samarkand with all my warriors. Being resolved to punish his insolence, I penetrated far into the desert which separates our territories. But the cunning of Qamar ad-Din led him to avoid a regular engagement, and when at length I came in sight of him, he was strongly posted among hills and defiles, which rendered approach difficult. I patiently sought an opportunity of attacking him to advantage, and at last compelled him to risk a battle. The conflict was obstinate, and the fortune of the day for some time uncertain, but my personal exertions prevailed. I struck him from his horse by a blow on the helmet, which so stunned him that he was carried senseless out of the field, and his soldiers, seeing their commander in this condition, took to flight. Before the next morning he escaped in the darkness of the night, but his baggage and camp fell into my hands. Thus, by the gracious support of heaven, another formidable enemy was overthrown. I allowed my troops some days to repose in the plains of their victory, and then returned, laden with spoil, to Samarkand. My people welcomed me with acclamations, the learned offered me their praises, the Sayyids their blessings, and universal joy seemed to pervade Mavar-al-Nahar. Chapter 23. A.D. 1366. In the year 768, I entered my 32nd year and congratulated myself on having secured the tranquility of Mavar-al-Nahar when accounts arrived of fresh commotions in Kabul and Badakhshan. The governors I had appointed in those places had relaxed their vigilance, which gave encouragement to disorderly tribes. My presence, therefore, became necessary in those distant districts. Taking a select body of troops, I crossed the Oxus, and proceeding through the mountainous passes with celerity, I soon appeared in the heart of Badakhshan. The petty princes of that rugged country were not prepared for so sudden an incursion, and either fled or submitted. I treated them all with kindness who did not resist me, and compelled them only to join my standard, in order to suppress the rebels who infested the roads. By this method I cleared the mountains of banditti and restored peace to the inhabitants. Thence I turned my arms towards Kabul, which also yielded without opposition. In a short time I had the satisfaction of seeing both provinces reduced to order, and leaving the government of them in trusty hands, I returned to Samarkand, where my presence was required by more urgent affairs. Chapter 24. A.D. 1367. In the year 769, having attained the age of 33, I had leisure to review the condition of Mavar-al-Nahar, which I found flourishing in trade, agriculture, and population, the people living happily under a firm but mild administration. This tranquility emboldened me to look towards other kingdoms, especially towards Khorasan, which, since the death of its prince, had been much distracted by internal feuds. I therefore began to levy additional troops and to collect provisions and stores for an expedition into Khorasan, but several incidents combined to delay my purpose. Among these, the attempts of the Sufi chiefs in Khwarizm to shake off the allegiance they had promised, and the vacillation of certain Turkish tribes on my frontier compelled me to remain some time longer at home. I soon, however, brought these matters to a favorable conclusion. The Sufi princes renewed their homage, and I confirmed them in their government, while the Turkish tribes were either reduced to submission or forced to remove from the confines of my dominions. Thus every obstacle was removed which could hinder me from executing the great projects I had formed. I had, for nearly 10 years, reigned in Mavar-al-Nahar, and during that period had contended with numerous enemies, subdued countless difficulties, and at last established a firm empire, revered by my subjects and respected by the neighboring nations. Determined to spread the faith of Islam and the renown of my arms, I now, at the age of 33, prepared to extend my sway beyond the Oxus into the wide regions of the south and west. Chapter 25. Before, however, I commenced these conquests, I summoned a grand council at Samarkand, consisting of the most eminent Sayyids, the learned in the law, the chieftains of the tribes, and all the officers of my court. I laid before them my design, and requested their opinions. With one voice, they declared that the monarchy of Mavar-al-Nahar was not conferred on me that I might slumber in inactivity, but that I should exalt the Mussulman faith and subject all infidels to its authority. They therefore recommended that I should first occupy the strong places on the frontier, especially Termus and Balkh, whence I might with more convenience make incursions into the neighboring countries, and whither I might retreat in case of accident. This counsel I approved, and having ratified my determination by the authority of religion, I offered up prayers for the divine blessing and distributed large alms among the poor. I next formed a minute plan for the arrangement of my forces, assigning to each general his station and prescribing the route by which each division should march. The seat of government I left to my eldest son, with officers well skilled in civil affairs. The command of the army destined to follow me I assumed in person. Thus prepared, I took a solemn farewell of the learned, the Sayyids, and the principal inhabitants of Samarkand, and commending them to God, set out on my first grand expedition. Chapter 26. On crossing the Oxus, I advanced to Balkh, which was then the extreme boundary of my dominion on that side. Here I received ambassadors from several princes, either congratulating me on my success or solicitous to avoid my arms by timely submission. I treated them all with courtesy, but did not relax my preparations. As soon as the season of the year permitted, I marched forward, resolved to surmount every obstacle which might oppose me. In this place ends the detailed account of my own memoirs, written by myself, and describing the principal adventures of my early life and reign, from my 20th year, when I took up arms as a private individual, to my 33rd, when I found myself firmly seated on the throne of Mavar-al-Nahar, and at the head of a powerful army preparing to conquer the world. Chapter 27. After this period, my actions are recorded in the histories composed by my secretaries and by several learned men whom I employed to write down all events daily as they occurred. These documents are preserved in the archives of Samarkand and form many volumes, from which faithful extracts have been taken by various authors and have been translated into several languages. But to avoid prolixity, I do not insert them here. What is above given is my own narrative, written with my own hand, and containing a plain statement of facts, without any embellishment or ornament of style. Memoirs of Timur. Book 6. Account of my mounting the throne of the sovereignty in the city of Balkh. Chapter 1. When I had thus cleansed the region of Turan from the evil machinations of Emir Husin, there were 3 other claimants to the succession, each of whom, being puffed up with pride in consequence of being the chief of a great clan and having numerous followers, was desirous of raising the standard of royalty. The first of these was Shah Muhammad of Badakhshan, who considered himself as one of the princes of that country. The second, Amir Ki Kuseru, who called himself son-in-law to the Khan of the Desht Kipchak and was governor of Kutalan. The third, Muhammad, the son of Bien Seldus, who was the chief of several thousand families of the horde of Seldus. When I heard of their various pretensions, I clothed myself with patience. When this news was brought to Syed Abu al-Berkat, the father of blessings, he invited several of the Khane-Zades, young Sayyids of Termuz, Abu al-Muali, and Ali Akbar to join him. He then summoned all the claimants to a general council, and when the assembly was arranged in proper order, he addressed them. Praise be to God that the whole land of Turan is now cleansed of all disturbers of its tranquility. If you unite and elect one person as an elder brother, your union will ensure prosperity. But if you divide and form different kingdoms, the infidel jets will very shortly overwhelm you. Whatever is the opinion of each of you, be so good as to state it. Muhammad Shah, who was the head of the princes of Badakhshan, said, "Let us divide the country into 4 portions in a brotherly manner, each ruling his own province. But let us unite in opposing every enemy that dares to invade or oppose us." Abu al-Berkat replied, "A variety of rulers always occasions quarrels and dissensions. If it were intended by providence that there should have been 2 monarchs in the same kingdom, there would have been 2 gods, one to govern the heavens, the other the earth. But as there is only one God who is the Lord of all, there must only be one monarch in the same country, that the proof of unity may be evident and certain." Muhammad Seldus said, "It is contrary to our code of laws that any of us should fill the throne of the Khan, or that the people should be subservient to us. The prince Shurgumtumush Iglan is of the posterity of Genghis. Place him on the throne of sovereignty, and let the Emir Timur be his deputy and commander-in-chief, and we will be obedient to him." Abu al-Berkat replied, "It is contrary to the religion of Muhammad that his followers should be subservient to you who are infidels. Genghis was an inhabitant of the desert, who by violence and the force of his sword formerly gained a superiority over the Muslims, At present, the sword of the Emir Timur is not inferior to what Genghis Khan's sword was, when you all fled from Husin and concealed yourselves in the desert. It was not till Timur advanced alone against him that any of you dared to quit your hiding corners. He did not want your assistance to subdue his enemy, nor does he now want it. After a long discourse, he thus concluded, I have hitherto spoken to you as Turks, but I know that you are Mussulmans and believe in the religion of Muhammad. Now it is evident to all the followers of the Prophet, on whom be the grace of God, that he conquered the world from the unbelievers, from polytheists, from Jews, and from Christians, by the force of his victorious sword. Therefore he, Muhammad, became sole proprietor of the terrestrial globe. After him, the succession fell to the illustrious caliphs, who with their followers spread the religion of Islam over the face of the earth. After them, the property descended to the posterity of the Prophet, who, having legally obtained the inheritance, may appoint whomever they choose for their deputy. I, who am the lineal descendant of Husin, the grandson of Muhammad, in conjunction with all the Sayyids of Mecca and Medina, do consider and esteem Emir Timur as the deputy of the illustrious caliphs. We therefore do appoint him to be ruler over all the Mussulmans in the territory of Turan. When the assembly heard that the Mussulmans were unanimous and agreed in their choice, and that the people were inclined to me, Emir Kaikhosru said, Let us draw lots for the sovereignty, and let us solemnly promise that we will be obedient on whomsoever the lot shall fall. In consequence of this proposal, Abu al-Barkat wrote my name, and the name of the other 3 competitors on slips of paper, and placed them under the musella carpet for prayer. He then said to them, Thrust your hands under the carpet and take out the lots. They did so 3 times, and the lot of sovereignty came forth in my name. They were all ashamed, but they could not deny their agreement. The next day all the chiefs of the hordes and tribes came in a body to my tent, and the 3 competitors also entered and made their obeisance to me. After them came the Emirs al-Jaitu, Sarbuga, and Daoud, and bent their knees. When these illustrious chiefs had paid their respects, the assembly congratulated me, and Abu al-Barkat, with the Sayyids of Termuz, offered up prayers for my prosperity. Then the above-mentioned chieftains, with the 12 chiefs of the hordes, stood up and formed half circles to the right and left of my seat, after which Abu al-Barkat thus addressed the assembly. O assembly of Mussulmans, the Prophet hath said, I bequeath to my people 2 illustrious things. First, the sacred volume. Secondly, my descendants. Now these bequests are in the hands of the Emir Timur. Those who obey him shall be fortunate in this world and happy in the next. But those who disobey him will be unfortunate in this world and miserable in futurity. He then took up the Quran which was lying before me and placed it on the head of each person, saying, Let those who choose to enter into this covenant come, and those who choose to fall off, let them fall. Each person replied, We have heard and do obey. Thus they all agreed to my sovereignty and inaugurated me. Chapter 2. A.D. 1369. In the year 771, I entered my 35th year of age, on which occasion 4 of the most revered Sayyids, viz. Abu al-Barkat, Abu al-Mu'ali, Zinadin, and Ali Akbar, having chosen a fortunate hour, took me by the arms and placed me on the throne of sovereignty. After I was seated on the throne, I opened the Quran, which was my constant companion, to search for an omen, whether my government would endure. And this verse came forth, Say, God is the master of the world. He gives the kingdom to whom he chooses, and takes it away from those he chooses. The learned body, who was standing at the foot of my throne, wrote the interpretation of this verse, and read prayers for the perpetuity of my dominion. In the same manner, all the people, both great and low, held up their hands in prayer for my prosperity. After which all the nobles bent their knees and congratulated me. Then all the chiefs and officers of the hordes paid their respects. Then all the people, whether soldiers or citizens, called out, May your good fortune endure. Previous to the day of my coronation, I had formed regulations for my courts. I assigned to the Sayyids, to the prelates, and learned body a place on my right hand, to my sons and relations and nobles, that they should be seated in a half-circle round my throne. The Kurgians, lifeguards, were to be placed behind the throne, the commanders of divisions to be in front, facing me. The 12 Yusuval aides-de-camp or orderlies were to stand 3 in front, 3 on each side, and 3 behind the Kur, and the other officers and soldiers to be seated according to their respective ranks. After forming the court in this manner, I sent for all the treasure and valuables that I possessed, and distributed them amongst the nobles, the officers and soldiers, according to their respective ranks, and I then gave away to the persons assembled all my ready money, my horses, swords, caps, so that all that remained were the clothes on my back and 2 horses in my stable, and even of these Amir Jaku asked for one, which I gave him, by which means all I kept to myself was 1 horse, 1 sword, 1 shield, 1 spear, 1 quiver with its bow and arrows. When the nobles of the hordes and tribes witnessed my liberality and generosity, they came and bent their knees and said, "You are well entitled to the throne and sovereignty." At this time, one of my confidential servants said to me, "There is not a single article left in your store." I replied, "If I am a king, all the wealth of the world is mine. Whatever property my subjects possess is mine. They are merely my repositories. And if I am not a king, whatever I may now have will not remain." I then commanded a proclamation to be made that all people, whether great or low, Turks or Persians, noble or mean, officer or soldier, were in perfect security from me, and I issued edicts through all parts of my dominion, stating that I had pardoned all guilty persons of every description, that all those who had drawn their swords against me, done evil to me, or had excited enmity against me, I now considered as my friends, and that I had eradicated from my bosom all animosity or revenge, that they might feel confident and happy, and whatever property of mine had been stolen or plundered during the disturbances, I freely gave to the possessor. That I forgave all the followers of Amir Husin, and that they might remain secure wherever they were dispersed, and keep whatever property of his they had. I then issued orders to all the chieftains on the boundaries and the governors of the fortresses of Shadman, Kunduz, Badukshan, Andijan, Turkestan, Kabbalistan, Kashgur, Tashkund, Kujend, and the confines of the Desht Kipchak and Khwarizm, confirming them in their governments and commands and assuring them that they need not harbor an idea of any change. When the Eid festival of the month of Ramzan arrived, I went to the great mosque of Balkh and performed my prayers. The Mussulmans invited me to commence the service. I replied that I did not consider myself worthy of acting as Imam, President. They said, "We consider your Highness as the successor of the illustrious Caliphs and the Muravij, patron of the Mohammedan religion, the guardian of the Holy Land, the protector of the servants of God, the respecter of his saints. It is therefore proper that you should preside." The Khatibi preacher then mounted the pulpit, and after offering up glory and thanksgiving to God and the Prophet, and praise of the illustrious Caliphs, Khulfa Rashidin, may paradise be their dwelling, he commenced the khutbah in my name, in these words: "O Lord, assist the Mussulman armies and camps wherever they are, or wherever they may be, whether in the east or in the west, by the good fortune of the just Sultan, the illustrious Khakan, the renowned Emperor, the exalted Prince, the Khakan son of the Khakan Amir Timur Gurgan. May God Almighty perpetuate his dominion and government, and extend his beneficence and justice to all Mussulmans." After the conclusion of this speech, all the nobles and principal persons of Jagtay and the chiefs of the tribes and hordes came up and congratulated me. When I quitted the mosque, I placed my foot in the stirrup, and attended by all the commanders and officers, I proceeded to the Keetal Palace. I then politely took leave of them, sent each of them a feast on account of the Eid, and dismissed them to their respective homes. Some days after, I appointed Murad Bahadar, son of Chugan Balas, to be governor of Balkh, and gave him a written code of regulations for his guidance, pointing out to him how he was to behave himself, both to soldiers and subjects, and in what style he should live and conduct himself on all occasions. On the 2nd day of the month of Shu Al, AH 771, being then 35 years of age, having selected a fortunate moment, I marched from Balkh and proceeded towards the capital, Samarkand. The first day I encamped on the banks of the Jihun, which was 7 fursuk from Balkh, and enjoyed myself there till my family and all the heavy baggage of the army came up. Chapter 3. When the troops had assembled, I crossed the river Jihun and encamped in the plains of Kesh, where I halted for some time and was waited upon by all the nobles and principal inhabitants of the towns, and by all the chiefs of the hordes and tribes, whether formerly friends or enemies, all came and claimed my protection. From thence I marched to the vicinity of Samarkand, and was there met by all the nobles and persons of note, by all the prelates and learned body of that city, who congratulated me and made offerings for my prosperity. That very day, being Friday, I went to the great mosque and said my prayers with a very numerous congregation, after which the khutbah was read for my success from the pulpit of Samarkand, being now the capital of my empire. But Khwaja Abd Allah, who was the most celebrated theologist of the age, refused to join in the blessing. Here follows the anecdote of the Sayyid's dream of the Prophet, who commanded him to pray for Timur's success, etc. In consequence of this manifestation of the Prophet's regard, I ordered that another large mosque should be built in Samarkand, also a monastery, and houses for the dervishes and pious Mussulmans. Chapter 4. After I had mounted the throne in my capital of Samarkand, I formed a council and drew up a code of regulations for my government. I then ordered a general proclamation to be made that whoever had any claims on me should come forward and make them known. And every person that I had been intimate with from the days of my childhood to the present time, I called by his name and conferred favors on him, and with whomsoever I had been acquainted either as friend or enemy, I acted in a uniform manner to all, and bound them in the ties of gratitude. I gave injunctions to all my servants that they were never on any account to change or alter the orders that I should issue, and that if any minister or officer should be guilty of deviation from this rule, he should be punished, because one of the rights of princes is that their words and orders should be the law of the land. I ordered that a code of regulations should be formed for the payment of the officers and soldiers and their allowance of provisions. Also rules for conferring titles and the high offices of generals and ministers, which were to be considered as a standing order and guidance of their conduct. In the same manner, I directed that regulations should be written for the holding of public assemblies in peace, and for maneuvering armies in the field during war, and for the conduct of my soldiers towards their fellow subjects. In the first council, I fixed the Siurgailat, permanent grants of land for charitable purposes, and I appointed Syed Abdallah to be the Sadr, superintendent of this institution, and to be chief magistrate of the Sayyids, and I nominated Syed Abd al-Rahman to be the Sheikh al-Islam, head of religious affairs, and Syed Zaya ad-Din to be the chief judge, and I ordered that on all occasions of ceremony, the Sayyids and the Mushik and Ulama, prelates and learned body, should be seated on my right hand. But there arose a great controversy between them, the Sayyids and learned body for precedency, or which should be the nearest to the throne. As the arguments on both sides were very long and noisy, I was much amused with the disputation. I, however, took care that the Sayyids were never to be treated with contempt or abused, and forbade their ever being bound or put to death, and if any person injured them, he was to be severely punished. One of the holy and learned Sayyids named Abu al-Muali, who had frequently opposed my ambition and had done everything to injure me, I treated with the greatest respect, which made him ashamed of his past conduct and desirous of my pardon. I therefore, for the sake of the Prophet, forgave him. While I was seated in the assembly, an ambassador from Syed Ali, the Vali, ruler of Mazindaran, was introduced and delivered a message from his master. After he had been seated some time, Syed Abu al-Berkat asked who his master was and of what family. The ambassador immediately traced the Vali's genealogy to Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, and acknowledged that he had been sent to learn my character and disposition. I said to him, "Well, what do you think of me?" He replied, "I find that you prefer justice to violence, truth to falsehood, virtue to vice, and that you honor and respect the descendants of Muhammad, which is a clear proof that victory and fortune will be the constant attendants of your Highness's stirrup as the supporter of the Mussulman religion. I praised the ambassador for his ability and ingenuity. Syed Abu al-Berkat was also lavish in his praise, and pronounced that as long as I persevered in such conduct, I should be triumphant and successful. Ignorance, irreligion, vice and tyranny being ever the cause of the ruin of a government. At this council, I gave the government of Samarkand to Amir Daud, and conferred the insignia of the standard and kettle drum on Amir Jaku and several other chiefs. I made Hussein Berlas president of the council. I gave charge of the large seal to Ike Timur and disposed of all the other appointments among my friends. I also ordered that no revenue or taxes should be collected from the inhabitants of Samarkand, Bokhara, or their dependencies, and issued a public edict that they were to be exempt from all claims. Chapter 5. A.D. 1371. In the year 773, being the second of my reign and the 37th of my age, I prepared for marching to subdue Khwarizm, whose ruler, Hussein Sufi, had not observed his engagements, but had begun to harass my frontiers. When I reached the banks of the Jihun, I halted, and was there joined by the ambassador of Melk Ghias Adin, son and successor of the late Azadin, ruler of Khorasan. That prince, wishing for my friendship, sent me many costly presents, in return for which I clothed his envoy with a robe of honor and dismissed him with all courtesy. I now learned that Hussein Sufi's troops had passed the frontier and were plundering my subjects. On hearing this, I sent a division of my army to oppose them, which drove them back in confusion. The survivors fled into the fort of Kat, whose governor and Kazi shut the gates against me. I immediately advanced, and after a resolute assault, carried the place by storm and left it in the hands of my officers. Encouraged by this success, I resolved to march against the principal fortress of Khwarizm. Hussein Sufi came out to meet me with his army, but on my nearer approach he sent an ambassador offering submission and proposing a family alliance, as he had done before. To avoid unnecessary bloodshed, I again accepted his overtures upon condition that he should quietly submit to my authority and receive my agents. Thus he contrived once more to appease me, and I returned towards Samarkand. Chapter 6. On my departure, however, Hussein Sufi broke his faith and ill-treated my agents. I discovered that this breach of promise was partly instigated by the treacherous advice of Kai Khusru, who was still eager to excite enemies against me. His intrigues caused fresh disturbances in various quarters, which demanded my presence. I therefore placed my army in movement under pretense of going on a hunting excursion, but in reality to punish the traitors. Arrived near Kesh, I called a grand assembly and produced the proofs of Kai Khusru's guilt. All the chiefs declared that he deserved death, but I contented myself with transferring the government of Kutalan from him to another and giving him into the charge of his enemy to be kept in confinement, thus sparing his life, though he had repeatedly endangered mine. I then marched with my troops into Khwarizm, where I compelled Hussein Sufi to renew his homage and to deliver his niece Khan Zaid in marriage to my eldest son, Jahangir. The marriage was solemnized with much pomp, and a large portion of Khwarizm was assigned to her as her dower, Hussein being continued as its nominal governor. After these arrangements, I returned to Samarkand, carrying the bride with me. Chapter 7. A.D. 1372. In the year 774, being then 38 years of age, I was informed that the Jet commander, Qamar Adin, had renewed his inroads on our borders, and that my son Omar Shaikh had formed a plan to cut off his retreat. I therefore placed myself at the head of a strong force and, after several engagements, drove the Jets to seek refuge in their deserts. The Prince Omar Shaikh distinguished himself by his bravery and gave me the highest satisfaction. We gained much plunder from the enemy and completely broke their power for that season. My time was now chiefly occupied in settling disputes among the Turkestan tribes and receiving the homage of others who sought my friendship. At length, my son, Muhammad Jahangir, fell dangerously ill. I hastened to Samarkand, but it was decreed that I should lose him in the bloom of his age. This affliction deeply wounded my heart, and for several days I shut myself up, refusing to see anyone. My grief was augmented by reflecting that he left two infant children, Pir Muhammad and Muhammad Sultan. But rousing myself from unavailing sorrow, I devoted double care to their education, that they might in some measure inherit the qualities of their father. My officers all endeavored to comfort me, reminding me that the children were pledges of consolation from heaven. Chapter 8. A.D. 1373. In the year 775, I was again alarmed by news of fresh attempts on the part of the Yeats. Their commander, Kuma Adin, had fled from me with a handful of men and lived among the mountains, but still contrived to draw together soldiers of fortune and to excite commotions in Mavarolnaha. This restless adversary compelled me more than once to take the field and to traverse the desert in pursuit of him. After various skirmishes, I at last dispersed his followers, seized his camp and baggage, and he himself was obliged to fly alone, disguised as a beggar. Some say he perished in the woods from cold and hunger. Others pretend that he escaped to distant lands. In either case, he was no longer formidable, and Mavaralnaha enjoyed repose. Soon after this event, Tuktumush Khan, a descendant of Genghis, arrived at my court, bringing intelligence that an enemy had dispossessed him of his rightful inheritance in the Desht Kipchak, or country of the Golden Horde. Tuktumush having before been known to me, I received him with distinction and determined to restore him to his throne, hoping thereby to secure a faithful ally on my northern frontier. But before engaging in this enterprise, I judged it prudent to cement my authority more firmly at home and to provide for the internal peace of my extensive dominions. Here, for the present, end my personal memoirs. The succeeding events of my reign, including the restoration of Tuktumush, my conquests in Khorasan, Persia, Hindustan, Syria, and Anatolia, and the final extension of my empire, are recorded in the chronicles of my reign, which were compiled daily under my own inspection. To avoid prolixity, I do not insert them in this place.